Winter came to Blackthornne province like a funeral shroud, thick and suffocating, wrapping itself around the cliffs and the sea and the fortress that ruled them both. Up there on the highest point of rock, where the northern wind hit hard enough to crack stone, Blackthornne Keep stood like a monument to something darker than power. It was a place where men went to disappear, where loyalty was measured in blood, and where Duke Cedric Blackthorne sat on his throne of obsidian and iron, watching the world bend its knee or break its spine, trying. At 36 years old, Cedric had already buried 3 men who thought they could stand against him. 2 had been nobles. 1 had been his own cousin. The graves were unmarked, somewhere beneath the castle foundations, and the servants whispered that on quiet nights you could still hear them screaming through the walls. Cedric never bothered to confirm or deny the stories. Fear was a tool, and tools didn't need explanations. But tonight, standing alone in the great hall with nothing but torchlight and silence for company, even the Duke of Blackthorne looked like a man who'd lost something he couldn't name. The Northern Territories had always been brutal. You learned that early, or you didn't live long enough to regret it. Cedric's father had taught him that lesson with fists and fire, beating the weakness out of him one broken rib at a time until there was nothing left but steel and rage and an understanding that mercy was just another word for suicide. By the time the old Duke died, choking on his own blood after a hunting accident that nobody questioned too closely, Cedric had already learned the only law that mattered in Blackthorne. Possess or be possessed. He possessed everything now. The land, the trade routes, the noble families who smiled at him during court gatherings while their hands trembled around their wine glasses. He owned judges and soldiers and merchants who'd sell their daughters if it meant staying in his good graces. Blackthorne Keep was the center of the northern world, and everyone inside it understood that the Duke's word was the only law that counted. Everyone except the woman currently locked in the Eastern Tower, wearing chains forged specifically for her wrists. Lady Alara Ashford, daughter of the traitor baron who'd tried to sell northern territories to the crown's enemies. Sister to the idiot knight who'd drawn steel in the throne room and died with Cedric's blade through his throat before he'd finished his battle cry. The last living remnant of a family that had gambled everything on rebellion and lost so completely that even their name was being erased from the historical records. Cedric had executed her father personally. Quick and clean, one stroke of the headsman's axe in the castle courtyard while the entire nobility watched. No speeches, no mercy. Just blood on stone and the sound of a body hitting the ground. He should have killed Alara too. Every advisor in his court had said so. Every political alliance demanded it. Even his own instincts, honed by years of survival in the most vicious territory in the kingdom, told him that leaving her alive was the kind of mistake that got men killed. Instead, he'd locked her in the tower and spent the last 3 months trying to figure out why. The great hall stretched out before him like a cathedral built for violence. Marble floors reflected torchlight in patterns that looked like blood. Tapestries depicting centuries of Blackthorne victories hung from walls 30 feet high. The throne itself sat on a dais of black stone, carved from a single piece of rock, hauled up from the sea cliffs by 100 slaves who died during the construction. Cedric walked toward it slowly, his boots echoing in the emptiness. He'd sat on that throne and sentenced men to death. He'd negotiated trade agreements that made him richer than the king himself. He'd broken noble families and built new ones from the wreckage, always making sure they understood exactly who controlled their future. But he couldn't make himself order Alara Ashford's execution. The problem wasn't sentiment. Cedric had crushed sentiment out of himself years ago, ground it down until nothing remained but cold calculation and the understanding that weakness was just death wearing a patient mask. The problem was that every time he looked at her, standing in that tower cell with chains on her wrists and defiance burning in her eyes, he saw something he'd spent his entire life trying to destroy. Himself, before the beatings, before the scars, before he learned that survival meant becoming something harder than the men who wanted to break you. Cedric stopped in front of the throne, but didn't sit. Outside, the wind howled through the castle walls like something alive and hunting. Snow fell across the province in sheets so thick you couldn't see 10 feet in any direction. The northern sea crashed against the cliffs with enough force to shake the foundations. Inside Blackthorne Keep, the Duke who ruled everything stood alone in his empty hall and wondered when possession had started feeling like starvation. A side door opened. Footsteps approached from the shadows. Lord Theren Greaves, the Duke's chief advisor, and the only man in Blackthorne who could speak to Caedric without being invited, stepped into the torchlight looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. Theren was 63, gray-haired, scarred from a dozen battles, and smart enough to have survived 3 generations of Blackthorne rulers. He'd served Caedric's grandfather, watched Caedric's father destroy himself with paranoia and violence, and helped Caedric consolidate power after the old duke's death with a ruthlessness that still impressed the younger nobility. He looked at Caedric now with the expression of a man watching someone stand too close to the edge of a cliff. "Your Grace," Theren said quietly, "the prisoner is refusing food again." Caedric didn't turn around. "How long has it been?" 4 days. Theren moved closer, his voice dropping even lower. "The court is asking questions. Noble families are wondering why Lady Ashford still breathes. Parliament is sending letters demanding justice." "Justice," Caedric repeated softly. "That's what they're calling it? What would you call it?" The Duke finally turned, and even Theren, who'd seen Caedric at his worst, took an involuntary step backward. Caedric's eyes were the color of winter storms, gray and cold and absolutely merciless. He was tall, broad-shouldered, built like a man who'd spent his entire life training for war. Scars marked his face and hands, each one a story of survival written in damaged flesh. His hair was black, worn longer than fashion dictated because Caedric had never given a damn about fashion. He moved like violence contained, like something that could explode into brutality at any moment and wouldn't lose a second of sleep over the consequences. But right now, standing in the torchlight with shadows cutting across his face, he looked like a man staring at something he couldn't conquer through force. "I'd call it unfinished business," Caedric said finally. Theren was quiet for a moment. Then, carefully, "The Ashford bloodline ends with her. No heirs, no allies, no reason to keep her alive except what?" The advisor chose his next words with the precision of a man walking through a minefield. "Except that you visited her cell every night for the last month." Caedric's expression didn't change. "That's not a crime." "No, Your Grace, but it is a weakness." The temperature in the Great Hall seemed to drop 10 degrees. Caedric didn't move, didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. "Say that again." Theren met his eyes without flinching, which was either courage or suicide. And with Caedric, the line between them was thinner than most people understood. "The nobility is watching," Theren said quietly. "They see the Duke of Blackthorne, the most feared man in the kingdom, keeping a traitor's daughter alive. They see you visiting her, talking to her, and they remember what happened the last time a Blackthorne ruler showed mercy." "What happened was that my father got soft," Caedric said coldly. "Started believing loyalty was something you earned instead of something you took. And he died choking on his own blood because he trusted the wrong people." "Exactly." Caedric took a step forward. Theren held his ground, barely. "You think I'm getting soft?" "I think you're standing on the edge of something dangerous," Theren replied. "And I've served this house too long to watch it fall because of one woman." Silence filled the hall like water rising in a drowning room. Then Caedric smiled, and it was the kind of smile that made soldiers nervous and nobles reach for weapons they weren't carrying. "One woman," he repeated. "You make it sound like she matters, doesn't she?" The Duke turned away, walking toward the massive windows that overlooked the sea. Outside, winter continued its assault on the province, snow and wind and darkness that would kill an unprepared man in minutes. Caedric stared into it like he was looking for something he'd lost. "Bring her to me," he said finally. "The Eastern Study. 1 hour." "Your Grace?" "1 hour, Theren. And if anyone asks why, tell them the Duke of Blackthorne doesn't explain himself to servants." The advisor bowed stiffly and left without another word. Caedric remained at the window, watching his reflection in the glass. 36 years old, and he looked older, harder, like something carved from stone instead of born from flesh. He'd built an empire on fear and possession. He'd taken everything he wanted and crushed everything that stood in his way. He'd become exactly what his father's brutality had tried to create. A weapon without conscience, a ruler without weakness, a man who understood that mercy was just another word for defeat. And yet every night for the last month, he'd found himself walking to the Eastern Tower, standing outside Alara Ashford's cell, watching her through the iron bars like a man studying something he couldn't name. She never begged, never pleaded, never promised him anything in exchange for mercy. She just looked at him with those dark eyes and asked questions that cut deeper than any blade he'd ever faced. Do you sleep well, Your Grace? Do you ever wonder what you've become? Was it worth it, killing everyone who ever cared about you? Cedric had executed men for less. He'd burned entire villages for questioning his authority. He'd made examples of nobles who so much as whispered dissent. But he kept going back to that cell, kept standing in the shadows, listening to her voice, kept trying to understand why the daughter of a traitor felt more dangerous than every enemy army he'd ever faced. The hour passed slowly. Cedric moved through the castle like a ghost, checking defenses, reviewing ledgers, making sure the machinery of his power continued running smoothly. Servants scattered when they saw him coming. Guards stood straighter. Even the torches seemed to burn differently when the Duke walked past, like the fire itself was trying to avoid his attention. By the time he reached the eastern study, winter darkness had swallowed the province completely. The study was smaller than the Great Hall, more intimate, with bookshelves covering 3 walls and a fireplace large enough to roast a whole deer. Cedric had spent years in this room, learning strategy and politics and the 100 different ways to destroy a man without ever drawing steel. His father had beaten him here too, usually with a riding crop, sometimes with fists, always with that cold voice explaining that pain was just another form of education. Cedric poured himself a drink from the crystal decanter on the desk. Whiskey, imported from the southern provinces at a cost that could feed a village for a month. He didn't taste it, just held the glass and waited. The door opened. 2 guards entered first, armed and armored, flanking the prisoner like she was something dangerous instead of a woman barely over 5 feet tall, wearing chains and a torn dress that had once been nobility's finest silk. Alara Ashford stepped into the study, and Cedric felt something shift in the room's atmosphere. She was 26 years old and looked like someone who'd been raised on stories of honor and justice and all the other pretty lies noble families told their daughters. Dark hair fell past her shoulders, tangled and unwashed from months in the tower. Her face was thin, almost gaunt, hollowed out by grief and starvation and the kind of despair that broke weaker people within days. But her eyes, those dark eyes burned with something Cedric recognized immediately because he'd seen it in his own reflection for years. Rage. Not the hot, stupid rage that made men do foolish things, the cold kind, the patient kind, the kind that waited and watched and planned exactly how it would destroy you when the moment finally came. Alara looked at the Duke of Blackthornne standing in his expensive study with his expensive whiskey and his empire built on corpses, and she didn't look away. "Leave us," Cedric said to the guards. "Your Grace," one of them began nervously. "She hasn't been restrained." "I said leave." They left, quickly. The door closed with a sound like a tomb sealing. Cedric and Alara stood 10 feet apart, studying each other like chess players at the start of a game where the stakes were measured in lives instead of pieces. Finally, Alara spoke. Her voice was hoarse from disuse, rough from screaming during the first weeks of her imprisonment when she'd still believed someone might care. "You're going to kill me," she said. "That's why you brought me here." It wasn't a question. Cedric took a drink. The whiskey burned on the way down, familiar and comforting. "If I wanted you dead," he replied quietly, "you'd already be in the ground next to your father." Something flickered across Alara's face. Pain, maybe. Or memory. Or just the acknowledgement of a truth that cut deep enough to scar. Then why am I still breathing? The Duke set his glass down with careful precision. "That's what I've been trying to figure out." He moved around the desk, closing the distance between them slowly. Alara didn't retreat, didn't flinch, just watched him approach with those burning eyes, her chains rattling softly with each breath. Cedric stopped 3 feet away. "Your father tried to sell northern territories to the crown's enemies," he said. "Foreign powers who would have invaded this province, burned our cities, enslaved our people. He would have destroyed everything for gold and promises from men who wouldn't have honored them once they got what they wanted." Alara's voice was steady despite the chains and the fear he could see beneath her defiance. "My father was trying to save his family from you by betraying the kingdom? By surviving a system where men like you decide who lives and dies based on profit margins and power plays." Cedric smiled, and it was a terrible thing to see. "Men like me," he repeated. "You mean the men who keep this province from tearing itself apart? The men who make sure trade routes stay open and bandits stay dead, and noble families don't murder each other over inheritance disputes? I mean the men who built their power on corpses and call it justice." The temperature in the room dropped. Kaedric leaned forward, close enough now that Alara could probably smell the whiskey on his breath, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to keep meeting his eyes. "Your father made a choice," he said softly. "He gambled everything on rebellion. And he lost. That's not injustice. That's consequences. You executed him in front of the entire court," Alara whispered, and her voice was shaking now, not with fear, but with fury barely contained. "You made me watch. You wanted me to see what happens when someone stands against you." "Yes." "Why?" "Because," Kedrick said, and his voice had gone so cold it was like standing in the winter storm outside, "I needed everyone in that courtyard to understand that I don't make empty threats. Your father tried to destroy me. I destroyed him first. And I'd do it again tomorrow if someone else was stupid enough to try." Alara stared at him for a long moment. Then she did something Kaedric didn't expect. She laughed. It wasn't hysterical. Wasn't broken. Just bitter and sharp, and filled with an understanding that made Kaedric's instincts scream warnings he couldn't quite identify. "You're lying," Alara said quietly. Kaedric went very still. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," she replied. "You're lying. To yourself mostly, but also to me. Because if all you cared about was making an example, you'd have killed me the same day you executed my father. One axe, two bodies, clean and simple and absolute." Her chains rattled as she took a step closer, and Kaedric realized with something like shock that he hadn't moved to stop her. "But you didn't," Alara continued. "You locked me in a tower. You kept me alive. And every night for the last month you've come to my cell, just standing there, watching. Like you're trying to figure out some puzzle that doesn't have an answer." She was close now. Too close. Near enough that Kaedric could see the exhaustion in her face, the way malnutrition had carved shadows beneath her eyes, the trembling in her hands that she was trying to hide. Near enough that he could also see the absolute absence of fear. "So I'll ask you again," Alara whispered. "Why am I still breathing?" Kaedric stared at her, at this woman who should have been broken by now, who should have been begging for mercy or plotting escape, or losing her mind from isolation and grief. Instead, she was standing in his study, wearing chains and defiance like armor, demanding answers to questions he didn't know how to answer. "Because you remind me of someone," he said finally. "Who?" "Myself." The admission hung in the air between them like something dangerous and uncontrolled. Alara's expression shifted. Not softening exactly, but something in her eyes changed, like she was seeing Kaedric clearly for the first time. "You were beaten too," she said quietly. "Weren't you?" It wasn't a question. Kaedric didn't answer, didn't need to. The scars on his face and hands told enough of the story. "My father," he said instead, "believed that weakness was a disease, and he cured it the only way he knew how. With pain and fear and lessons taught with fists until you either learned to survive or you died trying." Alara watched him carefully. "And you survived?" "Yes. By becoming exactly like him." The words hit like a physical blow. Kaedric felt his hands curl into fists, felt the familiar rage rising in his chest, the kind that usually ended with someone bleeding on the floor and the Duke walking away without looking back. But he didn't move, didn't strike. Just stood there, staring at this woman who'd lost everything because of him, who should hate him more than anyone in the kingdom, and heard the truth in her words like a blade sliding between his ribs. "I became what I needed to become," he said finally. "The alternative was death." "No," Alara replied softly. "The alternative was being better than the man who hurt you." Silence crashed into the room like a wave against the cliffs. Outside, the storm continued. Inside, two people stood in a study lined with books about power and strategy and the art of ruling through fear, and neither of them looked away. Kaedric broke first. He turned, walking back to the desk, putting distance between them like he was retreating from something he couldn't fight. "You don't understand how this world works," he said roughly. "Honor doesn't keep you alive. Mercy doesn't protect you from enemies. Being better than the monsters just makes you their next victim." "Maybe," Alara said. "Or maybe you've been surrounded by monsters for so long you forgot there was any other way to survive." Kaedric grabbed the whiskey bottle and poured another drink with hands that weren't quite steady. "I rule the northern territories," he said quietly. "I control trade routes worth millions. I command armies that could destroy kingdoms. Noble families from across the realm bow to me because they know I have the power to end them. That's not monster behavior. That's survival. Is it? He spun around and the rage was back now, burning in his eyes. What would you have me do? He demanded. Give up everything I've built? Hand power over to men who destroy this province in months? Become weak just because some naive girl thinks honor matters more than results? Alara met his fury without flinching. I'd have you ask yourself one question, she said. When you look at everything you've built, all that power and fear and control, do you actually feel anything resembling satisfaction? The question landed like an arrow finding its target. Kadric stared at her, this woman in chains who somehow made him feel more exposed than any enemy he'd ever faced in battle. Get out, he said roughly. Your Grace, get out of my study, now. Alara held his gaze for one more moment. Then she turned toward the door, her chains rattling with each step. She was almost gone when Kadric heard himself speak again. You'll stay in the tower, he said, but no more chains. And the guards will bring you proper meals, 3 times a day. Alara stopped walking, didn't turn around. Why? Because, Kadric said quietly, and he sounded more tired than he'd ever allowed himself to sound before. I'm not ready to kill you yet, and I'm not sure I understand why. She left without answering. The door closed. Kadric stood alone in his study, surrounded by books and power and the empire he'd built from brutality and fear. And for the first time in years, he felt the weight of it all pressing down like winter snow piling up until the structure beneath started to crack. Outside, the storm howled. Inside, the Duke of Blackthornne poured another drink and tried not to think about dark eyes burning with accusations he couldn't answer. The following weeks transformed Blackthornne Keep in ways nobody could quite articulate, but everyone noticed. Alara remained in the eastern tower, but the cell became something closer to chambers. Kadric ordered furniture brought up, books, proper clothing. The chains disappeared entirely, replaced by guards stationed outside her door who understood that the prisoner was not to be harmed under any circumstances. The court watched with mounting concern. Lord Theren tried 3 separate times to convince Kadric that keeping Alara alive was strategic suicide. Each conversation ended with the advisor retreating and the Duke standing at windows, staring at horizons he couldn't quite see. Noble families began sending carefully worded letters. Merchants whispered in taverns. Parliament demanded explanations that never came. And every night, as winter darkness swallowed the province, Kadric found himself climbing the tower stairs. Sometimes he spoke to her through the door. Sometimes he entered and they sat in silence. 2 people trapped in a situation neither fully understood. Sometimes they argued with words that cut deeper than steel. Alara never softened, never pretended to forgive what he'd done. But she asked questions that forced Kadric to confront truths he'd spent his entire life avoiding. Do you have anyone who actually knows you? Not the Duke. You. When was the last time you made a decision based on what you wanted instead of what you needed to survive? If you died tomorrow, would anyone mourn the man or just the power he represented? The questions haunted him, not because they were cruel, because they were honest in ways nobody in his court had been for years. 3 weeks after their conversation in the study, Kadric entered Alara's tower chambers to find her standing at the window, looking out at the sea. She'd gained weight. Color had returned to her face. She was wearing one of the dresses he'd ordered brought up, deep green silk that made her look like nobility again, instead of a broken prisoner. But she still turned to face him with eyes that held no forgiveness. Your advisor wants you to kill me, she said without preamble. Kadric closed the door behind him. Theren wants a lot of things. But he's not wrong, is he? Every day I stay alive weakens your position, makes you look uncertain, vulnerable. She walked closer, and Kadric found himself tracking her movement with the intensity of a man watching something dangerous approach. So why haven't you done it? Alara asked quietly. What's stopping the most feared man in the kingdom from finishing what he started? Kadric didn't answer immediately. Outside, winter continued. Inside, the study's fireplace burned with light that cast dancing shadows across the walls. Finally, he spoke. You asked me if I felt satisfaction, he said. When I look at everything I've built, yes. The answer is no. Alara went very still. Kadric moved to the window, standing beside her but not touching, both of them staring out at the darkness beyond the glass. I have power, he continued quietly. I have wealth. I have armies and territories and influence that reaches into every corner of this kingdom. I've achieved everything my father tried to beat into me, everything I fought for, Everything I thought mattered. He paused. And it feels like nothing. The admission hung between them like something fragile and dangerous. When did you realize that? Elara asked softly. The night I executed your father. She turned to look at him, surprise showing on her face for the first time. Cedric kept his eyes on the sea. I stood in that courtyard, he said, watching him die. Watching you watch him die. And I felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not justice. Just emptiness. Like I'd reached the top of a mountain and discovered there was nothing there worth seeing. Why are you telling me this? Because you're the only person who's asked. Elara studied his profile in the firelight. This man who'd destroyed her family, who ruled through fear and violence, who'd built an empire on corpses and called it necessity. This man who, for the first time since she'd met him, looked like something other than a weapon-wearing human skin. What do you want? She asked finally. Cedric turned to face her, and his expression was raw in ways that made Alara's breath catch. I want to know if there's something else, he said. Some way to exist that doesn't require destroying everyone around me to stay alive. Some path that doesn't end with me dying alone in this castle, surrounded by people who fear me but don't know me. His voice dropped even lower. I want to know if it's possible to survive without becoming the monster. Elara held his gaze. Then she said something that would change everything. I don't know if it's possible, she admitted, but I know it's necessary. The words settled into the space between them like seeds in winter soil, waiting for spring that might never come. Cedric took a step closer, then another, until they were standing near enough that Elara could feel the heat from his body, could see the scars on his face in detail, could smell leather and smoke and something underneath that was just him. If I tried, he said quietly, would you help me? Why would I help the man who killed my father? Because, Cedric replied, and there was something desperate in his eyes now, something vulnerable that probably nobody else in the kingdom had ever seen. You're the only person who's ever looked at me and seen something worth saving. Elara stared at him, at this man who'd taken everything from her, who represented everything she'd been taught to hate, who should have been her enemy in every possible way. And she felt something shift inside her chest. Not forgiveness, not yet, maybe not ever, but something else, something dangerous and complicated and terrifyingly human. I would need conditions, she said finally. Name them. First, you tell me the truth. All of it. Everything about who you are beneath the Duke's mask. Done. Second, you start making different choices. Not overnight, not perfectly, but deliberately, consciously, with the understanding that power doesn't have to mean cruelty. Cedric nodded slowly. And third, Elara took a breath. You let me leave whenever I choose. No guards, no threats, no possession. If I stay, it's because I'm choosing to stay. Not because you're forcing me. The request hit Cedric like a physical blow. Every instinct he'd ever developed screamed warnings. Letting her go meant vulnerability, meant risk, meant giving up control in ways that could destroy everything he'd built. It meant trusting someone, something he'd sworn he'd never do again. Cedric looked at Elara, at her dark eyes burning with challenge and something that might have been hope. At the woman who'd lost everything because of him and was still offering him a chance at redemption he didn't deserve. And he made a choice that would either save him or destroy everything he'd ever built. Agreed, he said. Elara's eyes widened. She'd expected resistance, arguments, violence even, not immediate surrender. Just like that? She asked carefully. Cedric smiled, and for the first time since she'd met him, it looked almost genuine. You said possession isn't the same as loyalty, he said quietly. I'm starting to think you might be right. He turned toward the door, then paused. The tower door will be unlocked tomorrow morning, he said without looking back. You're free to leave whenever you choose, or stay. Either way, the choice is yours. He left before Elara could respond. The door closed behind him with a sound like possibility. Elara stood alone in the tower chambers, staring at the space where Cedric had been, trying to process what had just happened. The Duke of Blackthornne, the most feared man in the Northern Territories, had just given her freedom. Not because she'd begged, not because he'd gotten what he wanted from her, because she'd asked him to choose something other than possession. And somehow, impossibly, he had. Outside, winter continued its assault on the province. Inside, something new and fragile began taking root in the spaces between fear and hope. But neither of them understood yet exactly how dangerous their new arrangement would become, or how many people would die before it was finished. The following morning brought the first real test. Lord Theren entered the Duke's private chambers without knocking, which meant the situation was either urgent or catastrophic, possibly both. Cedric was already awake, standing at the window, watching dawn break across the sea. He'd slept poorly, haunted by dreams of his father's fists and Alara's questions, and the feeling of standing at the edge of something he couldn't see. "Your Grace," Theren said, and his voice carried the weight of bad news. "Lady Ashford's door is unlocked." "Yes, the guards reported she's free to leave." "Correct." The advisor's face went carefully blank, which was his equivalent of screaming panic. "May I ask why you've released the daughter of a traitor without consulting your council?" Cedric turned from the window. "No. Your Grace, I don't answer to my council, Theren. I don't answer to Parliament. I barely answer to the Crown itself. And I certainly don't need permission to make decisions about prisoners in my own castle." "This isn't about permission," the advisor said quietly. "This is about survival. The nobility is already questioning your judgment. Noble families are forming alliances against you. If they see you showing mercy to an enemy, then they'll learn mercy isn't the same as weakness," Cedric interrupted. "And anyone who mistakes it for vulnerability can bring their concerns directly to me, personally, at sword point, if necessary." Theren studied him for a long moment. "You're changing," he said finally. "I'm not certain it's for the better." "Neither am I." The admission surprised them both. Cedric moved away from the window, walking past his advisor toward the door. "Where are you going? To see if she's still here. And if she's gone, then I'll have my answer about whether any of this matters." He left Theren standing in the chambers, looking like a man watching the foundations of his world begin to crack. The tower stairs felt longer than usual. Cedric climbed them slowly, aware with each step that he was walking toward something that would either validate or destroy the choice he'd made. Part of him hoped Alara would be gone. That would be simpler, cleaner. He could return to ruling through fear and possession without the complication of someone who made him question everything. But a larger part, a part he'd tried to bury for years, hoped desperately that she'd stayed. He reached the tower door. It was unlocked, exactly as he'd ordered. Cedric pushed it open. Inside, Alara sat at the window, wearing the green dress, her dark hair catching morning light. She turned when he entered, and her expression was complicated in ways he couldn't quite read. "You're still here," he said quietly. "I'm still here." "Why?" Alara stood, walking toward him with careful steps, like she was approaching something that might bolt or attack depending on how she moved. "Because," she said, "I spent all night thinking about what you said, about wanting to know if there's another way to survive. And I realized something." "What?" "I want to know the answer too." Cedric stared at her. This woman who had every reason to hate him, who should have run the moment that door unlocked, who was instead standing in front of him offering something that looked dangerously close to partnership. "Your father killed my family," Alara continued quietly. "You killed my father. And somewhere in all that violence and revenge and survival, both of us became exactly what we were trying to escape." She took another step closer. "So maybe," she said, "just maybe, we can figure out how to be something different, together." The word hung in the air like a promise neither of them fully understood yet. Cedric felt something shift in his chest, not softening exactly, but changing, like ice beginning to crack after a long winter. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted. "I don't know how to be anything other than what I am." "Neither do I," Alara replied. "But we can learn." She held out her hand. Cedric looked at it. At this offer of connection from someone who should be his enemy. At the choice between possession and partnership. Between fear and something that might eventually become trust. He took her hand, and in that moment, with winter dawn breaking across Blackthornne province and the northern sea crashing against cliffs that had stood for centuries, the Duke who'd built his empire on brutality made the most dangerous choice of his life. He chose to try being human again. What neither of them knew yet was that this choice would attract enemies far more dangerous than any they'd faced before. That it would force Cedric to confront not just his past, but the entire system of power he'd built his life around. That before spring came to Blackthornne, blood would stain this castle floors and decisions would be made that could never be unmade. And that the greatest threat wouldn't come from outside the castle walls. It would come from within, from a woman who'd been watching the Duke's transformation with growing rage. Lady Vivien Laurent, the Chancellor's daughter, the woman Caedric had been expected to marry before Alara arrived, stood in her chambers 3 floors below the Eastern Tower, watching dawn break through her window. She'd heard about the unlocked door, about the Duke's nightly visits, about the way Caedric looked at the trader's daughter like she was something precious instead of something to be destroyed. And Lady Vivien, who'd spent her entire life preparing to be Duchess of Blackthornne, who'd traded favors and made alliances and positioned herself perfectly to control the most powerful man in the Northern Territories, realized with cold clarity exactly what she needed to do. If Caedric wouldn't kill Alara Ashford, then someone else would have to. And afterward, when the Duke was grief-stricken and vulnerable and desperate for comfort, Lady Vivien would be there to offer exactly what he needed: control, stability, a return to the brutal order that had kept Blackthorne strong. She smiled in the dawn light, already planning. What she didn't realize was that trying to kill the woman who'd begun to change Caedric Blackthorne would be the mistake that destroyed them all. The tower chambers were quiet as Caedric and Alara stood hand in hand, both of them feeling the weight of the choice they'd just made. Neither spoke. Words seemed inadequate for what had just shifted between them. Finally, Alara broke the silence. "What happens now?" "Now," Caedric said quietly, "we figure out if survival and humanity can actually coexist. And we do it before everyone who fears me decides to test whether I've actually gone soft." "You think they will?" "I know they will." He released her hand, already moving toward the door, his mind shifting into the strategic calculations that had kept him alive for years. "Stay in the tower today," he said, "not as a prisoner, as protection. The court is going to react badly to this, and until I know exactly who's planning what, I need you somewhere I can keep you safe." Alara raised an eyebrow. "That sounds like possession wearing a different mask." Caedric paused at the threshold, looking back at her. "The difference," he said, "is that you can refuse. You can walk out that door right now if you want, but I'm asking you to stay. Not because I'm forcing you, because I'm hoping you trust me enough to let me protect you." The distinction mattered. They both knew it. Alara nodded slowly. "One day," she said, "I'll stay today. But tomorrow, I'm walking through this castle like I have every right to be here. Because if we're actually doing this, if we're actually trying to change how power works in Blackthorne, then we can't do it with me hiding in a tower." "Agreed." Caedric left, closing the door softly behind him. The moment he was gone, the weight of what he'd just committed to crashed down like an avalanche. He'd released a prisoner without justification. He'd shown mercy to an enemy family. He'd made himself vulnerable in ways that could destroy everything he'd spent years building. And somewhere deep in his chest, beneath all the strategic calculation and survival instinct, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. It was terrifying. The day passed in a blur of council meetings and political maneuvering. Lord Theren worked overtime trying to manage the fallout from Alara's release. Noble families sent increasingly aggressive letters. The Chancellor himself arrived unannounced, demanding a private audience with the Duke. Caedric met with them all wearing the same mask he'd perfected over years. Cold, controlled, absolutely certain. He gave no explanations, made no apologies. Simply stated that Lady Ashford remained in Blackthorne at his pleasure, and anyone who questioned his authority could bring their concerns to the training yard for personal resolution. Most backed down immediately. But Caedric saw the calculations happening behind their eyes. The careful assessment of whether the Duke had actually weakened or was simply playing a deeper game they didn't understand yet. And he saw something else. Fear transforming slowly into contempt. That was dangerous. Fear kept people obedient. Contempt made them reckless. By the time evening arrived, Caedric was exhausted in ways that had nothing to do with physical exertion. He dismissed the guards outside his chambers, wanting privacy, needing silence. The moment he was alone, he poured himself a drink and walked to the window overlooking the sea. Winter darkness had swallowed the province completely. Snow continued falling in sheets so thick they erased the horizon. The northern sea crashed against cliffs with sounds like distant thunder. Caedric stood in his expensive chambers, wearing his expensive clothes, ruling his expensive empire, and wondered when everything had started feeling like a cage instead of a kingdom. A knock interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he said without turning. The door opened. Footsteps approached. Then a voice he hadn't expected. "You look troubled, Your Grace." Caedric spun around to find Lady Vivien Laurent standing in his chambers, wearing a dress that probably cost more than most people earned in a year. She was beautiful in the way calculated beauty always was, perfect and cold and designed to attract attention. Cedric had never felt less attracted to anything in his life. "Lady Vivien," he said carefully, "it's late for unexpected visits." She smiled, moving closer with steps that were probably meant to be seductive but just looked predatory. "I thought you might need company," she said. "The court is worried about you, your advisors are concerned, and I wanted to offer support during this difficult time." Cedric set his glass down, his instincts screaming warnings he couldn't quite identify. "What difficult time?" "The situation with the Ashford girl," Vivien replied, and there was something sharp in her voice now. "People are talking, Your Grace. They're saying you've grown soft, that you're making emotional decisions instead of strategic ones." "Are they?" It wasn't a question. Vivien took another step closer, close enough now that Cedric could smell her perfume. "Expensive. Overwhelming. They're saying you've forgotten what made Blackthornne strong," she continued. "That you're allowing sentiment to cloud your judgment. That perhaps you need someone to remind you of your responsibilities." Her hand touched his chest, light and possessive. "Someone who understands that power requires sacrifice. That mercy is weakness. That rulers cannot afford to let personal feelings interfere with necessary decisions." Cedric looked down at her hand, at this woman who represented everything he'd been expected to become. Every alliance he was supposed to make. Every political calculation that prioritized control over conscience. And he felt absolutely nothing. "Remove your hand," he said quietly. Vivien's smile faltered. "Your Grace, I said remove it." She stepped back, surprise and anger flashing across her face. Cedric moved past her, walking to the door and opening it deliberately. "It's time for you to leave," he said. "The court expects—" "I don't care what the court expects," Cedric interrupted. "I don't care what your father expects. And I especially don't care about whatever political arrangement you think we had. But we're done here, Lady Vivien. Now leave my chambers before I have you escorted out." The rage that crossed her face was almost beautiful in its intensity. "You're making a mistake," she said quietly. "A fatal one." Then Cedric smiled, and it was the same smile that had made soldiers nervous for years. "Probably," he agreed, "but at least it'll be my mistake." Vivien left without another word, her footsteps echoing down the corridor like threats she was already planning. The moment she was gone, Cedric closed the door and leaned against it, exhaustion crashing over him like winter waves. He'd just made another enemy. Another political complication. Another reason for the court to question his authority. But standing there in the silence of his chambers, thinking about Alara and the tower, and the choice he'd made that morning, Cedric realized something that would have terrified the man he'd been a month ago. He didn't regret it, not even a little. 3 floors below, in her own chambers, Lady Vivien stood at her window, staring out at winter darkness, her hands clenched into fists tight enough to draw blood. The Duke had rejected her, humiliated her, chosen a traitor's daughter over the most advantageous political marriage in the kingdom. That could not stand. She'd spent too long positioning herself, sacrificed too much, made too many promises to powerful people who expected her to deliver control over Blackthornne. If Cedric wouldn't see reason, then he'd have to be taught a lesson he'd never forget. And the lesson would begin with Alara Ashford's death. Vivien reached for the hidden panel in her chamber wall, retrieving the sealed letter she'd prepared weeks ago when she'd first started suspecting the Duke's interest in the prisoner. The letter was addressed to a group of assassins who specialized in making deaths look like accidents. Expensive, professional, completely untraceable if you paid enough. Vivien had always been willing to pay enough. She sealed the letter with wax and her family's signet, then called for a servant she knew could be trusted, or rather, threatened, into silence. "Deliver this to the Black Rose Tavern," she instructed quietly. "Hand it directly to the man at the corner table. No one else. And if you speak of this to anyone, I'll ensure your entire family disappears before morning." The servant nodded, terrified, and fled with the letter. Vivien returned to her window, already planning. The assassination would happen within days. Alara would die. Cedric would be devastated. And in that devastation, Lady Vivien would position herself as the stable, rational choice he needed. She'd comfort him, remind him of his responsibilities, guide him back to the brutal, controlled ruler he was supposed to be. And eventually, inevitably, he'd marry her. Because men like Cedric Blackthornne couldn't survive without their masks. and Vivien was very good at helping men remember exactly who they were supposed to be. What she didn't understand yet was that trying to kill the one person who'd started to change Ceadric would be the mistake that destroyed not just her plans, but the entire system of power they'd both built their lives around. Because some men, once you give them a reason to choose humanity over brutality, will burn down kingdoms rather than go back to being monsters. And Ceadric Blackthorne, for all his cruelty and violence and years of survival through possession, was about to discover exactly what kind of man he actually was beneath the Duke's mask. The kind who would raise the world to ash before letting someone hurt the woman who'd shown him there was something worth surviving for beyond power. But that realization would come with blood and fire and choices that would change the Northern Territories forever. And it was coming sooner than anyone expected. In 3 days, assassins would enter Blackthornne Keep. In 3 days, Alara would face death wearing nothing but the dress Ceadric had given her, and the strange, complicated feeling growing in her chest that might eventually become something close to love. In 3 days, the Duke of Blackthorne would make a choice between the man he'd been and the man he was desperately trying to become. And the castle built on centuries of brutality would finally learn whether mercy was weakness or the most dangerous weapon of all. But tonight, none of them knew what was coming. Tonight, Ceadric stood alone in his chambers, staring at winter darkness and thinking about a woman in a tower who'd asked him if it was possible to survive without becoming the monster. Tonight, Alara sat at her window, watching snow fall across the province and wondering if the Duke who'd killed her father could actually become someone capable of redemption. And tonight, in the shadows beneath Blackthorne Keep, assassins sharpened their blades and planned exactly how they'd make a traitor's daughter disappear without leaving evidence behind. Winter darkness pressed against the castle walls like something alive and hungry, waiting for the moment when violence would return to remind everyone in Blackthorne that mercy was just another word for the calm before blood. The assassins arrived on the 3rd night, during the worst storm Blackthorne had seen in decades. Wind howled through the castle corridors like something wounded and dying. Snow piled against the windows so thick it turned daylight into permanent twilight. The northern sea crashed against the cliffs with enough force to shake the foundations, and somewhere deep in the stone, the castle itself seemed to groan under the weight of winter's assault. Perfect conditions for murder. Ceadric was in the war room when the first scream echoed through the halls. He'd been reviewing supply routes with Lord Theren, calculating how long Blackthorne could survive if the storm cut them off from trade for another week. The numbers weren't good. Food stores were adequate but not abundant. Fuel supplies were running low. If the weather didn't break soon, they'd have to start making difficult choices about which parts of the castle stayed warm. Then came the scream, high and terrified, and cut short in a way that made every combat instinct Ceadric had ever developed snap to full alert. He was moving before Theren could speak, his hand already reaching for the sword he kept within arm's reach at all times. Years of survival had taught him that hesitation was just death wearing a patient mask, and that sound, that abruptly silent scream, meant someone in his castle was dying. The corridors were chaos. Servants ran in different directions, some toward the sound, most away from it. Guards appeared from their stations, weapons drawn, confusion evident on their faces because nobody attacked Blackthorne Keep. Nobody was stupid enough to breach the most fortified fortress in the Northern Territories during a winter storm. Ceadric grabbed the nearest guard by his armor. "Where?" he demanded. "The eastern wing, your grace. Near the—" He didn't wait for the rest, just ran, his boots pounding against marble floors, his mind already calculating trajectories and probabilities, and the sick understanding that the eastern wing meant the tower, meant Alara. He took stairs 3 at a time, sword drawn now, the blade catching torchlight as he climbed. Behind him, guards followed, but Ceadric was faster, driven by something that wasn't quite panic but felt dangerously close. The tower corridors appeared ahead. 2 guards lay dead outside Alara's door, throats cut so cleanly they'd probably died without understanding what happened. Professional work, expensive work, the kind of assassination that didn't leave evidence unless you knew exactly what to look for. Ceadric's blood went cold. The door stood open. He burst through it with his sword raised, ready to kill whatever he found inside, ready to face whatever had gotten past his defenses, and targeted the one person in the castle who'd made him question everything he'd spent years building. The scene that greeted him would haunt him for the rest of his life. 3 assassins dressed in black, faces covered, blades still dripping blood. One lay dead near the window, his chest opened by something sharp. Another was on his knees, clutching his throat, choking on his own blood. And Alara stood in the center of the room, holding a broken shard of mirror like a weapon, her dress torn and splattered with blood that mostly wasn't hers, her eyes wild with adrenaline and terror, and the kind of rage that comes from fighting for your life and winning against odds that should have killed you. The third assassin turned when Caedric entered, saw the Duke's sword, and made the fatal decision to try escaping instead of surrendering. Caedric killed him before he'd taken 3 steps. One thrust, clean and efficient, the blade entering between ribs, and finding the heart with the precision of a man who'd executed this exact movement hundreds of times before. The assassin dropped without a sound. Silence crashed into the room like a physical force. Caedric stood there, sword still raised, breathing hard, trying to process what he was seeing. Alara alive. 3 assassins dead or dying. Blood everywhere. And in his chest, beneath the tactical calculations and combat readiness, something that felt uncomfortably like terror. "Are you hurt?" he said roughly. Alara stared at him. At this man who'd killed her father, who ruled through violence, who was currently standing in her chambers holding a sword dripping with blood, and looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite identify. "I'm fine," she said, and her voice only shook a little. That was a lie. She wasn't fine. She was covered in blood and shaking from adrenaline and probably 30 seconds away from collapse. But she was alive, and the men who'd come to kill her weren't, and that was the only truth that mattered right now. Caedric lowered his sword slowly, his eyes scanning the room with tactical precision, taking in the broken furniture, the shattered mirror, the way Alara had positioned herself with her back to the corner, maximizing visibility and minimizing attack angles. "You fought them," he said quietly. "What was I supposed to do? Let them kill me? How many were there?" 3. His eyes moved to the dead assassin near the window, then back to Alara. "You killed one before I arrived. It wasn't a question." Alara nodded, the reality of what she'd done starting to sink in now that the immediate danger had passed. She looked down at her hands, at the blood coating her fingers, at the broken mirror shard she was still clutching like it was the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly become unmoored. "He was going to cut my throat," she said softly, "so I put glass through his eye socket instead." The casual brutality of the statement, delivered in that same quiet voice, hit Caedric harder than any blow he'd taken in combat. This woman, this nobleman's daughter who should have been raised on poetry and dancing and the other useless accomplishments aristocratic families taught their children. She'd just killed a professional assassin with improvised weapons and was standing there discussing it like she was describing the weather. "Good," Caedric said finally. Alara's eyes snapped to his. "Good? You survived. That's what matters." Guards poured into the room behind him, weapons ready, but the fighting was already over. Caedric didn't turn around, just kept his eyes locked on Alara, watching for signs of shock or breakdown or any of the other reactions people usually had after killing someone for the first time. But Alara just stood there, covered in blood and holding her makeshift weapon, looking less like a victim and more like someone who'd discovered exactly what she was capable of when pushed to the edge. Lord Theren appeared in the doorway, taking in the carnage with the expression of a man who'd seen too much violence to be surprised by it anymore but was still capable of being deeply concerned about its implications. 3 professional killers, he said quietly, inside Blackthornne Keep, during a storm that should have made infiltration impossible. He looked at Caedric. Someone paid a fortune for this. Caedric's jaw tightened. He knew that, had already calculated the possibilities the moment he'd seen the bodies. Professional assassins didn't come cheap. The kind who could breach Blackthornne's defenses cost more than most noble families earned in a year, which meant someone with serious resources and connections wanted Alara dead. "Search them," Caedric ordered. "Find anything that identifies who hired them. And bring me the guard captain who was supposed to be watching this corridor. Now." The guards moved immediately, 2 of them beginning the grim work of searching corpses, while others disappeared to find the captain. Theren moved closer, lowering his voice so only Caedric could hear. "This is what happens when you show mercy, Your Grace. The court sees weakness, enemies see opportunity, and people die." Caedric turned to face his advisor, and the look in his eyes made even Theren, who'd known him for years, take a step backward. "If this is what showing mercy looks like, the Duke said quietly. Then I'm going to enjoy discovering what real brutality feels like when I find whoever ordered this. The temperature in the room dropped. Caedric turned back to Alara, who was still standing in the center of the carnage, still holding that broken mirror shard, still looking like something between a victim and a weapon. You're moving to my chambers, he said. Tonight. No arguments. Alara blinked. Your chambers? The only place in this castle I can personally guarantee is secure. Unless you'd prefer to stay here and wait for the next attempt. She looked around at the blood and bodies and broken furniture, at the evidence of how close she'd come to dying tonight, at the realization that someone wanted her dead badly enough to send 3 professionals during a winter storm. Your chambers, she agreed quietly. Caedric nodded once, then turned to the guards still searching the bodies. Anything? One of them held up a small leather pouch. Gold coins, Your Grace. Enough to buy a small estate. And this. He showed Caedric a folded piece of paper, sealed with wax that had already been broken during the search. The Duke took it, unfolding the message with careful precision. His eyes scanned the contents once, then again. And with each word, his expression went from cold to absolutely murderous. Theren watched his face change and felt his stomach drop. Your Grace? Caedric crushed the paper in his fist, the parchment crumpling with a sound like bones breaking. Get Lady Vivien Laurent, he said, and his voice had gone so cold it was like standing in the storm outside. Bring her to the Great Hall. I don't care if she's asleep. I don't care if she's indisposed. Drag her out of her chambers if necessary, but bring her to me within the hour. Understanding dawned on Theron's face, then concern, then something that might have been fear. Your Grace, if you're suggesting what I think you're suggesting, I'm not suggesting anything, Caedric interrupted. I'm stating facts. Lady Vivien hired these assassins. She paid them with gold bearing her family crest, and she signed the contract with her own seal. He held up the crumpled paper as evidence. So bring her to me. Now. The guards scattered immediately, understanding that when the Duke used that tone, arguments were just another form of suicide. Theren remained studying Caedric with the careful attention of a man trying to calculate whether his lord was about to do something catastrophically stupid or strategically brilliant. If you kill the Chancellor's daughter without trial, he said quietly, you'll start a war. Parliament will unite against you. Noble families will call for your execution. The crown itself might intervene. Caedric looked at his advisor. At this man who'd served 3 generations of Blackthornne rulers, who'd helped him consolidate power, who taught him that survival meant making hard choices and never looking back. Then they'll learn, the Duke said softly, that there are things more dangerous than war. Like what? Like making me choose between politics and the people I care about. The admission hung in the air between them like something fragile and explosive. Theren stared at him. At this man who'd spent years building walls around anything resembling emotion, who'd turned himself into a weapon specifically designed to rule without sentiment interfering. You care about her, the advisor said. The Ashford girl. It wasn't a question. Caedric didn't answer. Didn't need to. The evidence was standing right there in the carnage of the tower room, and the fact that he'd run up those stairs with his sword drawn and his heart pounding, and something that felt uncomfortably close to panic driving every movement. That makes her your greatest weakness, Theren continued. Every enemy you have will target her now. Every political alliance will leverage her against you. And eventually, no matter how strong you are or how many people you kill, someone will find a way to use her to destroy you. I know. Then send her away. Give her gold. Safe passage. A new identity in some distant province where your enemies can't find her. Protect her by removing her from your life entirely. Caedric turned to look at Alara again. She was being helped into a chair by one of the guards now, her adrenaline finally crashing, her hands starting to shake as the reality of what had happened began sinking in. She'd survived because she was stronger than anyone expected, because she'd fought instead of freezing, because somewhere beneath the nobleman's daughter, who should have been helpless, there was steel, just like him. No, Caedric said quietly. Theron's expression shifted to something between exasperation and genuine concern. Your Grace, I said no. She stays. And anyone who tries to hurt her again will discover exactly what happens when you mistake my mercy for weakness. He walked toward Alara, crouching down in front of her chair so they were eye level. She looked up at him, and even through the shock and fear, her eyes still burned with that same defiant fire he'd seen the first time they met. I'm sorry, Kadric said, and the words felt foreign on his tongue because he couldn't remember the last time he'd apologized to anyone for anything. Alara blinked. For what? For putting you in danger. For not realizing someone would try this. For every choice I've made that led to you having to kill a man to stay alive. He reached out slowly, carefully, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. When she didn't, his hand settled over hers, both of them still covered in blood. This won't happen again, he said quietly. I promise you that. How can you promise that? Alara asked, and her voice was steadier now. You can't control everything. You can't protect me from every threat, and I won't live in a cage just because someone wants me dead. You won't have to. Because by tomorrow morning, everyone in this kingdom is going to understand what happens when they target someone under my protection. The words were a promise and a threat simultaneously. Alara studied his face. This man who'd killed her father, who ruled through fear and violence, who was currently looking at her with an expression that was equal parts protective and absolutely murderous. What are you going to do? She asked. What I should have done the moment I decided to let you live, Kadric replied. Make it clear that you're not a prisoner anymore. You're not collateral. You're under the direct protection of the Duke of Blackthornne, and anyone who harms you is declaring war on me personally. That's going to make you more enemies. I already have more enemies than I can count. One more won't make a difference. He stood, his hand still holding hers for a moment longer than necessary before releasing it. Can you walk? Alara nodded, getting to her feet with visible effort. The adrenaline was wearing off now, leaving exhaustion in its wake. But she stood straight, refusing to show weakness, even covered in blood and surrounded by corpses. Kadric turned to the nearest guard. Escort Lady Ashford to my chambers. Post guards outside the door. No one enters without my explicit permission. If anyone tries, kill them. Those are direct orders. Yes, Your Grace. He looked back at Alara. Get some rest. We'll talk more in the morning. After I've dealt with the person who tried to have you killed. The way he said it made it clear that dealing with meant something terminal and probably violent. Alara hesitated, then said something that surprised them both. Don't kill her. Kedric's expression went flat. Excuse me? Lady Vivien, I assume that's who you're talking about? Don't kill her without trial, without proof, without giving her the chance to defend herself. She hired assassins to murder you. Then prove it, Alara replied. In front of the court, let everyone see exactly what she did and why. Because if you just execute her without process, you prove every critic right. You prove that you're exactly the brutal tyrant they think you are. And what if I am? The question hung between them like a blade. Alara met his eyes without flinching. Then I wasted 3 men's lives tonight staying alive, she said quietly, because I'm not interested in surviving just to watch you become your father. The words hit like a physical blow. Kadric stared at her, this woman who'd just killed someone to stay alive, who was covered in blood and exhausted and still finding the strength to challenge him about mercy and justice, and all the things he'd spent years convincing himself didn't matter. Fine, he said finally. A trial. In front of the full court, tomorrow at dawn. And afterward? Afterward, the evidence will speak for itself, and justice will be served according to the laws I'm supposed to uphold. He didn't mention that those laws included execution for conspiracy to murder. Didn't need to. Alara nodded slowly, accepting the compromise. The guards escorted her out, leaving Kadric standing in the carnage of the tower room with Lord Theren, both of them staring at the bodies and the blood and the evidence that showing mercy had made enemies bold enough to strike inside Blackthornne Keep itself. You're changing, Theren said quietly. Yes, I'm not certain it's for the better. Neither am I, Kadric admitted, but I'm certain that continuing to be what I was would have killed me anyway, just slower and lonelier. He looked at his advisor. Prepare the Great Hall for a trial. Send messages to every noble family within riding distance. I want witnesses. I want the entire court present. And I want Lady Vivien to understand exactly how much I know before she walks into that room. Theren bowed stiffly and left. Kadric remained in the tower, surrounded by dead assassins and the wreckage of furniture, trying to understand when his carefully constructed empire had started feeling like something worth burning down, if it meant protecting one person who made him remember what it felt like to be human. The storm outside continued its assault on Blackthornne, wind howling and snow falling, and the northern sea crashing against cliffs that had stood for centuries. Inside, the Duke who ruled everything stood alone and wondered if survival and humanity could actually coexist, or if trying to have both was just another form of suicide wearing a different mask. Dawn came cold and bitter. The great hall filled before sunrise, nobles arriving despite the storm, drawn by curiosity and rumor and the understanding that something significant was about to happen. Servants hurried to light torches and prepare seating. Guards took positions along every wall, armed and armored. Their presence a reminder that Blackthornne Keep was a fortress first and a court second. Ceadric watched from the dais where his throne sat, already dressed for what was coming. Black leather and steel, his sword belted at his side, his expression carved from winter stone. He looked like exactly what he was, a man prepared for violence masquerading as justice. Elara stood beside him. That alone sent shockwaves through the assembled nobility. The positioning was deliberate, strategic. She wasn't seated with prisoners or witnesses. She was standing beside the Duke, on the same level, wearing a dress he'd had brought to his chambers that morning. Deep red silk that made her look like blood on snow. A statement in fabric. The court noticed. Whispers spread like fire through dry timber. Lord Theren approached, his face carefully neutral. Lady Vivien has been brought to the antechamber, Your Grace. She's demanding to speak with you privately before the proceedings begin. Denied, Ceadric said without taking his eyes off the assembling crowd. She can say whatever she wants to say in front of the entire court. The Chancellor has also arrived. He's requesting an audience. Also denied. Your Grace, this could be handled more diplomatically. Theren, Ceadric interrupted, his voice dropping to something dangerous. 3 men broke into my castle last night and tried to murder someone under my protection. Diplomacy ended the moment they drew their weapons. What happens now is justice. Or vengeance, depending on your perspective. The advisor withdrew without further argument. Elara touched Ceadric's arm lightly, drawing his attention. Are you sure about this? She asked quietly. No, he admitted, but I'm sure about what happens if I do nothing. She studied his profile. This man who'd spent years perfecting the art of ruling through fear, who was about to put that reputation on trial alongside Lady Vivien, who looked like he was preparing for war instead of a court proceeding. Just remember, she said softly, that justice and revenge aren't the same thing. Even when they look identical, I know the difference. Do you? Ceadric turned to face her fully, and something in his expression made her breath catch. Justice is what the law demands, he said quietly. Revenge is what I want. And right now, I'm trying very hard to choose the former, even though every instinct I have is screaming for the latter. Why? Because you asked me to. And because becoming something other than my father means making different choices even when they feel like weakness. The admission hung between them, raw and honest. Before Elara could respond, trumpets sounded. The court fell silent, and Lady Vivien Laurent was escorted into the great hall wearing chains. The sight shocked the assembled nobility. Vivien was the Chancellor's daughter, heir to one of the most powerful political families in the kingdom. She should have been treated with courtesy and respect even if accused of crimes. Instead, she entered wearing iron shackles and a simple prison dress, escorted by guards who looked ready to kill her if she so much as breathed wrong. The message was clear. Rank meant nothing here. Not anymore. Vivien's eyes found Ceadric immediately, and the rage in them could have melted steel. But beneath the rage was something else. Fear. The understanding that she'd miscalculated badly and was now facing consequences she hadn't anticipated. She was brought before the dais and forced to kneel. Ceadric let the silence stretch. Let the entire court see her kneeling. Let the humiliation sink in for every noble family who'd thought the Duke had gone soft. Lady Vivien Laurent, he said finally, his voice carrying to every corner of the massive hall, you stand accused of conspiracy to murder. Specifically, hiring professional assassins to kill Lady Elara Ashford within the walls of Blackthornne Keep. Vivien's chin lifted defiantly. I stand accused by whom? She demanded. On what evidence? This is a farce. A political attack designed to damage my family because I rejected the Duke's inappropriate advances. Gasps rippled through the court. Ceadric's expression didn't change. Didn't react to the accusation at all. Just gestured to one of the guards, who stepped forward holding the crumpled contract in the leather pouch of gold. Evidence, the Duke said quietly. A signed contract bearing your family's seal, payment in gold marked with your crest, and 3 dead assassins who were carrying instructions written in your hand. He held up the papers so the court could see. Would you like to examine the documents? Confirm their forgeries? Explain how your signature and seal appeared on a murder contract if you had nothing to do with it? Vivien's face went pale. The Chancellor stood from his seat in the gallery, his voice booming. This is absurd. My daughter would never— Sit down, Cedric interrupted, his voice cutting through the hall like a blade. Zindi, or be removed. This is a trial, not a political debate. You have no authority to— I have absolute authority inside these walls, the Duke said, and now his voice had gone cold enough to freeze blood. This is Blackthornne Keep, my territory, my castle, my law. And if you interfere again, Chancellor, you'll join your daughter in chains. The threat landed like a thunderclap. The Chancellor remained standing for a moment longer, calculating odds and consequences and the understanding that Cedric meant every word. Then, slowly, he sat back down. Silence reclaimed the hall. Cedric returned his attention to Vivien, who was still kneeling but no longer looking quite so defiant. 3 men are dead, he continued. 2 of my guards. 1 professional killer. 2 more assassins were killed by Lady Ashford defending herself. All because someone wanted her dead badly enough to breach my castle during a winter storm. He stepped down from the dais, moving closer to Vivien, his boots echoing on marble floors. So I'll ask you once, and only once. Did you hire those assassins? Vivien's hands clenched into fists. She looked around the hall at the assembled nobility watching her, at her father who couldn't help without making things worse, at the evidence laid out like an execution waiting to happen. Then she made her choice. Yes, she said clearly. More gasps, shock spreading through the court like a physical wave. Cedric stopped walking. Why? Vivien lifted her chin, and now there was something almost proud in her expression, something defiant despite the chains and the fear. Because you were supposed to be mine, she said. We had an arrangement, a political alliance that would have strengthened both our houses. And you threw it away for a traitor's daughter who has no power, no connections, nothing to offer except whatever weakness she represents. She looked past Cedric to where Alara stood on the dais, her eyes burning with hatred. You are making the Duke soft, Vivien continued, speaking directly to Alara now, making him question the very things that kept Blackthornne strong. Mercy, compassion, all the pretty lies that get men killed in the real world. So yes, I hired those assassins. Yes, I wanted you dead, because Cedric Blackthornne needs to be the monster this kingdom requires, not whatever pathetic version you're trying to turn him into. The Great Hall was absolutely silent. Cedric looked at this woman who just confessed to attempted murder in front of the entire court, who justified it with political necessity and personal entitlement, who genuinely believed that killing someone was acceptable if it served her ambitions. You're right about one thing, he said quietly. Vivien's eyes snapped back to him. I was supposed to be a monster, Cedric continued. That's what my father tried to create, what years of survival reinforced, what the court expected and what enemies feared. He took another step closer. But you made a critical mistake. You assumed that because I was trying to be something different, I'd forgotten how to be what I was. Understanding dawned on Vivien's face too late. The law regarding conspiracy to murder is clear, Cedric said, addressing the full court now. Death by execution. No exceptions. No mercy for rank or family connections. The punishment exists specifically to prevent nobles from using hired killers to settle political disputes. He looked at Vivien again. You confessed in front of witnesses. The evidence is incontrovertible, and the sentence is already written. No, Vivien whispered. Lord Theren stepped forward from his position near the throne. As chief advisor to the Duke, I confirm the law as stated. Conspiracy to murder within the Duke's territory carries a mandatory death sentence. The Chancellor rose again, desperation evident in his voice. There must be exile, imprisonment. Some alternative? There isn't, Cedric interrupted. Your daughter hired assassins to commit murder in my castle. She confessed, and now she'll face the consequences of her choices. He turned to the guards. Take her to the courtyard. Prepare the headsman's block. The guards moved immediately, hauling Vivien to her feet despite her sudden resistance. She was screaming now, all pretense of dignity abandoned, begging and pleading and promising things she couldn't deliver. The court watched in stunned silence as she was dragged from the hall. Cedric returned to the dais, his expression unchanged, looking like a man who just ordered breakfast instead of an execution. But inside, beneath the cold exterior and tactical control, something twisted. Because Vivien had been right about one thing. He was trying to be something different, trying to choose justice over vengeance, mercy over brutality, humanity over the monster. And his first act in that new direction was still ordering someone's death. Alara touched his arm again as he reached the throne. "You gave her a trial," she said quietly. "You let her defend herself. You followed the law exactly as it's written. That's not vengeance." Cedric looked at her. At this woman who'd survived assassination attempts and still found ways to see honor in brutal necessity. "It doesn't feel like justice either," he admitted. "Maybe that's how you know you're doing it right," Alara replied. "If it felt good, that would be revenge." They stood together on the dais while the court slowly emptied. Nobles filing out to witness the execution that would happen within the hour, guards maintaining order, the machinery of justice grinding forward with inevitable finality. Lord Theren approached once the hall had mostly cleared. "The Chancellor has requested permission to speak with his daughter before the execution." "Granted," Cedric said. 15 minutes, under guard supervision. And after we send a message to every noble family in the kingdom. Anyone who targets someone under my protection will face the same consequences. No negotiations, no exceptions. No mercy, regardless of rank. That's going to make you significantly more enemies, I'm aware." Theren studied him for a long moment. "You're committing to a path that's harder than the one you left," he said quietly. "Being a monster is simple, clear. You do what's necessary and don't look back. But trying to be something better while still ruling through strength, that's going to tear you apart eventually." "Probably," Cedric agreed. "But at least I'll die knowing I tried." The advisor left without another word. Alara and Cedric remained on the dais, surrounded by empty throne room and torchlight, and the weight of choices that couldn't be unmade. "Do you want me to come to the execution?" Alara asked finally. "No." "Why not?" "Because," Cedric said, turning to face her fully, "you've seen enough death because of me, and because I need to know that when this is over, there's at least one person in this castle who doesn't look at me and only see the executioner. I already see more than that. Do you?" "Yes." She reached up slowly, her hand settling against his face, her thumb tracing the scar along his jaw. "I see someone trying very hard to be better than his worst instincts," she said softly. "Someone choosing difficult paths when easy ones are available. Someone who's terrified he's going to fail but keeps trying anyway." Her hand dropped. "That's not a monster. That's just human." The admission settled into Cedric's chest like something both painful and necessary. Before he could respond, bells began tolling, the signal that the execution was ready. Cedric straightened, his expression shifting back to the cold mask he wore for public consumption. The Duke of Blackthornne preparing to do what dukes had done in this castle for centuries. Rule through fear and blood and the absolute certainty that consequences were inevitable. He left Alara standing on the dais and walked toward the courtyard where Lady Vivien Laurent would die because she'd made the mistake of threatening something he cared about. The execution itself was efficient. Vivien knelt at the block. The headsman raised his axe, and with one clean stroke, the Chancellor's daughter ceased to exist. Cedric watched without flinching, without emotion, just cold assessment of whether the job was done correctly. The body fell. Blood stained the courtyard stones. And every noble present understood exactly what happened when you made the Duke choose between politics and protection. But as Cedric turned to leave, walking back through corridors toward his chambers where Alara waited, he felt the weight of that choice settling onto his shoulders like winter snow piling up until the structure beneath started to crack. He'd tried to do it right. Tried to choose justice over vengeance. Tried to be something better than the monster. And he'd still ended the day with blood on his hands and another body added to the foundations of his power. Maybe Theren was right. Maybe trying to be both strong and humane was just another form of suicide wearing a different mask. Or maybe it was the only path worth taking even if it destroyed him in the end. Cedric didn't have answers, just questions that cut deeper with each step. By the time he reached his chambers, night had fallen again. The storm continued outside, relentless and unforgiving. Inside, Alara sat by the fireplace, staring into flames that cast shadows across her face. She looked up when he entered. "Is it done?" she asked. "Yes." "How do you feel?" Cedric closed the door behind him, leaning against it like the only thing keeping him upright. "Empty," he admitted. "Like I did everything correctly, and it still feels wrong." Alara stood, crossing the room to stand in front of him. "That's because you're finally understanding the difference between doing what's necessary and doing what's right. Sometimes they're the same thing, sometimes they're not. And sometimes you have to live with the weight of not knowing which one you chose. She took his hand, the same way he'd taken hers in the tower after she'd killed the assassin. But you gave her a trial. You followed the law. You made it clear that rank doesn't protect people from consequences. That's more than most rulers would have done. It doesn't feel like enough. Maybe it never will, Alara said softly. Maybe that's how you know you're still human. They stood together in the firelight, two people trying to figure out if survival and conscience could coexist, or if one would inevitably destroy the other. Outside, Blackthornne Keep settled into night watch. Guards patrolled, servants cleaned. The castle continued functioning with mechanical precision, but something had changed, something fundamental and irreversible. The Duke had shown mercy and brutality simultaneously, had tried to balance justice with protection, had made enemies with his choices and allies with his principles. And across the northern territories, in castles and courts and political chambers, people were beginning to understand that Caedric Blackthorne was no longer the monster they'd feared. He was something more complicated, more dangerous, a man with power trying desperately to figure out how to use it without losing his humanity in the process, which meant he was vulnerable in ways a simple tyrant never was. And vulnerability, in the world they lived in, was the most dangerous thing of all. 3 days after the execution, the Chancellor sent a formal declaration of vendetta. 6 noble families joined him. Parliament began drafting articles of impeachment. The storm that had isolated Blackthorne finally broke, and war came riding on the first clear dawn, with armies and sieges and the understanding that trying to be better than a monster didn't make you any less of a target. It just gave your enemies more weapons to use against you. War came to Blackthorne with the methodical precision of a headsman's axe. The Chancellor's armies arrived first, moving through the northern passes with siege equipment and supply trains that stretched for miles. 6 noble houses contributed troops, turning what should have been a localized conflict into something that threatened to tear the entire province apart. Parliament issued formal declarations. The Crown sent representatives demanding Caedric's surrender for trial in the capital. And through it all, Blackthornne Keep stood like a monument to defiance, its obsidian walls reflecting winter sunlight, its gates sealed against everything outside. Caedric spent the first week of the siege in the war room, surrounded by maps and tactical reports and the grim mathematics of survival. Lord Theren stood beside him, along with the military commanders who'd served Blackthorne for decades. They calculated supply lines and defensive positions, and the 100 different ways a castle could hold or fall depending on choices made in moments of crisis. The numbers weren't encouraging. "We have food for 3 months if we ration carefully," Theren said, his finger tracing supply routes on the map. "Water is unlimited from the underground springs. Ammunition for another 2 months of sustained combat. But fuel for heating runs out in 6 weeks, and if this siege extends into deep winter, we'll freeze before we starve." Caedric studied the map with eyes that hadn't slept properly in days. The Chancellor's forces surrounded them on 3 sides, using the natural terrain to create a stranglehold that was slowly tightening. The northern sea protected their rear, but that also meant no escape route if things went catastrophically wrong. They were trapped, contained, waiting for either relief that might never come or mistakes from enemies who'd spent months planning this assault. "What about reinforcements?" one of the commanders asked. "Surely some of the noble families loyal to Blackthorne will send troops." Caedric's jaw tightened. That was the problem. The question nobody wanted to address directly. Where were the allies? Where were the houses who'd sworn loyalty? Where were the trade partners and political connections who'd benefited from Blackthorne's power for years? The silence in the war room answered more clearly than words. "They're waiting to see who wins," Theren said quietly. "If we hold, they'll claim they were always loyal. If we fall, they'll say they had no choice but to support the Chancellor." "Cowards," one of the commanders spat. "Survivors," Caedric corrected. "That's how this world works. Loyalty lasts exactly as long as it's profitable. The moment it becomes expensive, people find very creative ways to redefine their obligations." He turned from the map, walking to the window that overlooked the courtyard. Below, soldiers drilled in formations. Servants hauled supplies. The machinery of siege defense operated with practiced efficiency. But Caedric could feel something shifting, some intangible quality in the air that spoke to instincts honed by years of surviving in environments where weakness was terminal. Something was wrong. Not tactically, not strategically, something deeper, more fundamental. He just couldn't identify what. Send riders to the eastern estates, he ordered, the families who've stayed silent. Tell them I'm offering land grants and trade concessions to anyone who commits troops within the week. Make it clear this is their last opportunity to choose the winning side. And if they refuse, then we remember their names for when this is over. The commanders dispersed to execute orders. Theren remained, studying Cedric with the careful attention of a man who'd learned to read moods through decades of service. You're worried, the advisor said quietly. I'm always worried. That's what keeps me alive. This is different. You're expecting something specific. Cedric didn't answer immediately. Just stood at the window, watching his soldiers move through their drills, trying to identify the source of the unease crawling up his spine like frost spreading across glass. When armies surround you, he said finally, the danger isn't usually the siege itself. It's what happens inside the walls while everyone's focused on external threats. You think there's a traitor in the castle? I think there's always a traitor. The only question is whether they've made their move yet. Theron's expression went carefully neutral. That's paranoia talking. No, that's experience. My father taught me that lesson with his own blood. The knife that kills you is usually held by someone close enough to reach vital organs. The advisor was quiet for a moment. Then, you trust Lady Ashford? The question landed like a blade between ribs. Cedric turned slowly, his eyes locking onto Theren with an intensity that made the older man shift uncomfortably. Why would you ask that? Because she's the variable that changed everything. Before she arrived, your alliances were stable. Your authority was unquestioned. You ruled through fear, and everyone knew exactly where they stood. And now? Now you're trying to be something different, Theren said carefully. And change creates vulnerability. Enemies exploit vulnerability. And the most effective way to destroy a man is through the people he cares about. Cedric stared at his advisor. This man who'd served 3 generations of Blackthornne rulers, who'd helped him consolidate power after his father's death, who'd been present for every major decision over the last decade. This man who was very carefully planting seeds of doubt about the one person in the castle Cedric had allowed himself to trust. Alara had nothing to do with this war, Cedric said quietly. Didn't she? Her father was executed for treason. Her family was destroyed. She has every reason to want revenge. And what better revenge than making you care about her, than using that connection to tear down everything you've built? The accusation hung in the air like poisoned gas. Cedric felt rage building in his chest, the hot, immediate kind that wanted to grab Theren by the throat and demonstrate exactly what happened when someone questioned his judgment. But beneath the rage was something colder, more calculated, the part of him that had survived by never dismissing warnings just because they were uncomfortable. Get out, he said roughly. Your Grace, get out of my sight before I do something we'll both regret. Theren bowed stiffly and withdrew, leaving Cedric alone with his thoughts and the distant sounds of an army preparing to destroy everything he'd spent his life building. The Duke stood at the window for a long time, watching winter darkness gather across the province, trying to separate instinct from paranoia, survival from sentiment, trying to figure out if the advisor who'd never steered him wrong was offering genuine concern or executing something more sinister. Either way, the seed was planted, and doubt, once introduced, was harder to kill than any enemy army. That night, Cedric found Alara in his chambers, reading by firelight. She'd made herself at home in the weeks since the assassination attempt. Her clothes hung in the wardrobe beside his, her books stacked on the desk. Small changes that transformed the Duke's private chambers from a sterile command center into something that almost resembled living space. Cedric stood in the doorway watching her, trying to see what Theren had implied, trying to identify manipulation or hidden agenda, or any sign that this woman who'd survived assassination attempts and still offered compassion was secretly engineering his destruction. He saw nothing, just Alara, reading, looking tired and worried and human in ways that made his chest ache with something he couldn't quite name. You're staring, she said without looking up from her book. Sorry. She marked her place and set the book aside, turning to face him fully. Her expression shifted from neutral to concerned in the space of a heartbeat. What happened? Nothing. Cedric, I've seen you after battles, after executions, after political disasters. You've never looked like this. So either tell me what happened or stop pretending everything's fine. The directness was so characteristic that Cedric felt something crack inside his chest. This woman who refused to play games, even when games were the only language the court understood. Who demanded honesty in an environment where honesty could get you killed. Who was either the most genuine person he'd ever met or the most skilled manipulator he'd ever encountered. And he had no idea which. "Theren thinks you're a traitor," he said bluntly. Elara blinked. Then, surprisingly, she laughed. Not hysterically, just bitter and sharp. "Of course he does. I'm the obvious scapegoat. The enemy's daughter who somehow survived when everyone expected her dead. The variable that doesn't fit the established order." She stood, crossing to where Kadric remained frozen in the doorway. "Do you think I'm a traitor?" The question was simple, direct, the kind that demanded an answer without equivocation. Kadric looked at her, at this woman who'd killed an assassin to stay alive, who'd challenged him to be better than his worst instincts, who'd stood beside him during a trial that made enemies of half the kingdom, who'd had a dozen opportunities to betray him and hadn't taken any of them. "No," he said finally. "Then why do you look like you're trying to convince yourself?" "Because Theren's never been wrong before. Because doubt is easier to plant than remove. Because every survival instinct I have is screaming that trusting anyone is just another form of suicide." He moved into the room, the door closing behind him with a sound like finality. "And because if you are manipulating me, Elara, if this is all some elaborate revenge scheme, then I need to know now, before it's too late to salvage anything." Elara's expression went very still, then cold. Colder than Kadric had ever seen her. "If I wanted revenge," she said quietly, "I had it the night those assassins came for me. All I had to do was let them kill me, die in your castle, make sure everyone knew it was because you showed me mercy. That would have destroyed you more effectively than any conspiracy." She took a step closer, and now there was steel in her voice. "But I didn't. I fought. I survived. And I stayed. Not because I'm manipulating you, because I'm stupid enough to believe that maybe, just maybe, you're actually trying to become someone worth staying for." The words hit like physical blows. Kadric stared at her, this woman who'd just laid herself bare in ways that made him feel like the worst kind of coward for ever doubting. "I'm sorry," he said roughly. "Don't apologize. Just decide. Either you trust me or you don't. Either I'm your partner in this or I'm your prisoner again. But I won't live in this halfway space where you look at me like I might be the enemy." She was right. They both knew it. Kadric reached for her, his hand settling against her face the same way hers had settled against his before. "I trust you," he said quietly. "More than I've trusted anyone. That's what terrifies me." "Why?" "Because everyone I've ever trusted has either died or betrayed me. And I don't know which would destroy me more if it happened with you." Elara covered his hand with hers, holding it against her face. "Then I guess we both have to survive long enough to find out." They stood together in the firelight, two people trying to build something stable on foundations made of violence and trauma, and the slim hope that change was actually possible. Outside, the siege continued. Armies waited, enemies plotted, and inside Blackthornne Keep, in the deepest chambers where the Duke's most trusted advisors gathered, Lord Theren met with 5 other men in a room that wasn't on any official map. The conspiracy had been months in planning, years really. If you counted back to the moment Theren realized that Kadric was becoming too unpredictable, too willing to deviate from the brutal stability that had kept Blackthorne strong. The Duke was changing. And change, in Theron's experience, was just another word for weakness waiting to be exploited. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Let the siege continue. Let Kadric exhaust himself defending against external threats. Then, when his attention was focused elsewhere, when he was vulnerable and isolated, strike from within. Open the gates. Let the Chancellor's forces flood the castle. Blame it on the chaos of war. And in the aftermath, position Theren himself as the stable hand needed to rebuild Blackthorne's strength. The other conspirators were all men who'd benefited from the old order. Military commanders, senior advisors, men who understood that Kadric's attempts at mercy and justice threatened everything they'd built their power on. Men who believed that removing him was the only way to save Blackthorne from itself. "It's time," Theren said quietly. "The Duke is distracted. The Ashford woman has his attention. The siege provides perfect cover." One of the commanders shifted uncomfortably. "If this fails—" "It won't," Theren interrupted. "I've been planning this since the moment he released the girl from that tower. Since the moment he chose sentiment over strategy. Since the moment he proved he was no longer the ruler Blackthorne needs. Another advisor spoke up. And after? When the Chancellor's forces control the castle, then we negotiate. We've already established contact with the Chancellor through intermediaries. He wants Caedric dead and the North stabilized. We want power and protection from prosecution. Everyone gets what they need. Theren stood, his shadow stretching across the hidden chamber's walls like something monstrous. Tomorrow night, he said. During the shift change, the eastern gate will be left unguarded for exactly 10 minutes. That's all the time the Chancellor's forces need to breach the outer defenses. After that, it's just a matter of reaching the Duke's chambers before he realizes what's happening. And Lady Ashford, one of the men asked. Collateral damage, Theren replied coldly. She dies with him. Clean, final, no loose ends. The conspirators nodded, each one making their final commitment to a course of action that would either secure their futures or end with their heads on spikes. Theren dismissed them with instructions to maintain normal appearances. Nothing suspicious, nothing that would alert Caedric's paranoia before the trap was fully set. When they were gone, he remained in the hidden chamber, staring at plans that had taken months to perfect. He'd served 3 generations of Blackthornne rulers, had helped build the Duke's power from nothing, had sacrificed his own opportunities for advancement to ensure the stability of the North. And now Caedric was throwing it all away for a woman who represented everything weak and sentimental about humanity. So Theren would do what he'd always done, what advisors had done throughout history when their lords lost sight of necessity. He'd save Blackthornne by destroying the man who no longer deserved to rule it. The next day passed with agonizing normalcy. Caedric continued coordinating defenses. Commanders drilled troops. Supplies were distributed. The siege machinery of survival operated exactly as it had for weeks. But Theren noticed things others missed. Small details. The way certain guards moved with slightly more purpose. The way specific commanders checked their weapons more frequently. The way tension built in the air like pressure before a storm. The conspiracy was moving forward. And Caedric, for all his tactical brilliance and survival instincts, suspected nothing. Or so Theren thought. That evening, as winter darkness settled across Blackthornne, Caedric stood in the war room reviewing the guard rotation schedules that had been prepared for the night watch. Something caught his eye. A small discrepancy. Nothing obvious, just a slight gap in coverage at the eastern gate during the shift change. The kind of thing that could be explained as clerical error or scheduling oversight. The kind of thing that created exactly 10 minutes of vulnerability. Caedric stared at the schedule, his mind working through implications with the cold precision of a man who'd survived by never dismissing patterns that didn't fit. Then he called for a specific guard captain, not one of the senior commanders. Someone younger, less connected to the established power structure. Someone who owed their position directly to Caedric rather than inherited authority. The captain arrived quickly, confusion evident on his face. The Eastern Gate schedule, Caedric said quietly. Who prepared it? Lord Theren's office, Your Grace. Same as always. And you reviewed it? Checked for errors? Yes, Your Grace. Everything appeared correct. Caedric handed him the schedule. Look at the shift change. Tell me what you see. The captain studied the document carefully. Then his expression shifted to alarm. That's a 10-minute gap in coverage, long enough for someone to open the gate without being seen, Caedric finished. Silence crashed into the room. The captain's hand moved instinctively toward his sword. Do you want me to arrest Lord Theren? No. Not yet. I need to know who else is involved, how deep this goes, whether this is just one man's ambition or a broader conspiracy. He took the schedule back, his mind already working through scenarios and countermeasures and the cold mathematics of betrayal. Double the guard at the Eastern Gate. Different men, ones who've never served directly under the senior commanders. Tell them nothing except that they're watching for infiltrators. And have them report any suspicious activity directly to me, not through normal channels. Directly. Yes, Your Grace. The captain left, moving quickly but not so quickly that it would attract attention. Caedric remained in the war room, staring at the schedule that had nearly gotten him killed, feeling something cold settle in his chest. Theren, his advisor for over a decade. The man who'd helped him survive his father's death and consolidate power. The man he'd trusted more than anyone except possibly Alara. A traitor. The realization should have hurt, should have triggered some emotional response beyond tactical assessment. But Cadric felt nothing except the familiar emptiness that came from having survival instincts validated by betrayal. Of course, Theren was the traitor. Of course, the closest advisor was the greatest threat. That's how this world worked. That's what his father had tried to teach him with fists and violence and lessons written in blood. Trust was just another word for the vulnerability that got you killed. And for a brief, stupid moment, Cadric had forgotten that truth. He found Alara in their chambers, exactly where he'd left her that morning. She looked up when he entered, and her expression shifted immediately to alarm. "What's wrong?" "Theren," Cadric said flatly. "He's planning to open the gates. Tomorrow night, let the Chancellor's forces breach the castle and kill us both." Alara stood slowly, her face going pale. "How do you know?" "Guard schedule. Small discrepancy that creates exactly the opportunity needed for infiltration. And when I started looking closer, everything else clicked into place. His constant suggestions to exile you, his warnings about trusting anyone, his perfectly timed doubts that kept me paranoid and isolated. He moved to the window, staring out at the besieging army surrounding them. He's been planning this for months, maybe since the moment I let you out of that tower. Since the moment I chose trying to be human over being the monster he needed me to be." Alara crossed to stand beside him, her hand finding his. "So what do we do?" Cadric was quiet for a long moment, calculating options and odds and the brutal reality of what survival would require. "We let him think it's working," he said finally. "Let the conspiracy move forward, but we change the script, set our own trap. And when the gate opens tomorrow night, we make sure the only people who die are the ones who betrayed us. That's dangerous. If anything goes wrong..." "Everything's already wrong," Cadric interrupted. "The man I trusted most is trying to kill me. Half my commanders are probably conspirators, and the only way out is through. So we either spring their trap or we sit here waiting to die." He looked at her directly. "I won't apologize for choosing survival, even if it means becoming exactly the monster I was trying not to be." Alara held his gaze without flinching. "Then we survive," she said quietly, "together, and we deal with the guilt afterward." The next day crawled by with agonizing slowness. Cadric maintained perfect normalcy, attended meetings, reviewed defenses, gave orders that suggested he suspected nothing, all while quietly repositioning loyal troops and preparing for the violence he knew was coming. Theren played his role flawlessly, offered advice, coordinated logistics, never showed a hint of the conspiracy moving forward beneath the surface. He was professional, efficient, exactly what he'd always been, which made the betrayal that much more devastating. Evening approached, the shift change neared, and Cadric positioned himself exactly where he needed to be to watch everything unfold. He'd moved Alara to a secured location with guards he personally trusted. She'd protested, wanting to stay, but Cadric had been firm. If things went wrong, at least one of them needed to survive to ensure whoever won the coming battle understood exactly what had happened. Now he stood in a concealed observation post overlooking the eastern gate, watching darkness gather and waiting for the moment when his most trusted advisor would reveal himself as the enemy. The shift change began on schedule. Guards moved through their rotations, and for exactly 10 minutes, as documented in the schedule, the eastern gate stood undermanned. Theren appeared from the shadows, moving with purpose toward the gate mechanism. Cadric watched from his vantage point, feeling something twist in his chest. Part anger, part vindication, part sorrow for what this meant about trust and loyalty, and whether any of it was ever real. Theren reached the gate controls. His hand settled on the locking mechanism, and for a moment he paused, looking around as if sensing something wrong. Then he pulled the lever. The eastern gate began opening with a sound like iron grinding against stone, and from the darkness beyond, the Chancellor's forces surged forward, pouring through the breach with weapons drawn and murder in their eyes. Exactly as planned. What they didn't expect was the ambush. Cadric's loyal troops had been positioned in concealed locations throughout the gatehouse and surrounding corridors. The moment enemy soldiers crossed the threshold, they were caught in a killing field. Crossbow bolts tore through the first wave. Soldiers dropped, screaming. The charge faltered as confusion spread through the attacking force. And Cadric emerged from his observation post, sword drawn, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Close the gate." Loyal guards moved immediately, fighting to reverse the mechanism Theren had opened. The advisor spun around, his eyes finding Cadric through the chaos, understanding and fury crossing his face in equal measure. "You knew," he said. I suspected, Kadric corrected. You confirmed it. More enemy soldiers poured through the gate before it could be fully closed. The gatehouse erupted into brutal close-quarters combat. Steel rang against steel. Men screamed and died in spaces too confined for proper tactics. Kadric moved through it like a force of nature, his sword finding targets with mechanical precision, every movement honed by years of survival in environments where hesitation was terminal. But his eyes never left Theren. The advisor had drawn his own blade, backing toward the interior corridors, trying to escape before the gate fully closed and trapped him with the consequences of his choices. Kadric pursued, his boots splashing through blood already coating the floor. They met in a corridor lined with torches, shadows dancing across stone walls worn smooth by centuries. Theren raised his sword defensively. You were supposed to be better than this, he said. Better than your father. Better than the monster Blackthornne needed. I was trying, Kadric replied coldly. Then you tried to kill me for it. Because you were destroying everything, showing mercy, choosing sentiment over strength, making Blackthornne weak. No, I was making it different. And you couldn't accept that the world might change without destroying you. Their blades met with a sound like thunder. They fought through the corridor, each one testing the other's defenses, looking for openings that decades of familiarity made difficult to find. Theren had trained Kadric when he was younger, knew his patterns, his weaknesses, his preferred attacks. But Kadric was faster now, stronger, and fighting with the cold certainty of someone who'd finally accepted exactly what survival required. Their blades locked. They stood face to face, both breathing hard, torchlight reflecting in their eyes. You taught me everything I know, Kadric said quietly, including how to recognize betrayal before it kills me. I taught you how to rule, Theren corrected. How to survive. How to be what Blackthornne needed. And you threw it away for a girl who made you weak. She made me human. Same thing. Kadric shoved him backward, breaking the blade lock, his sword moving in a pattern Theren recognized too late. The strike went through the advisor's guard, finding flesh beneath armor, cutting deep enough to be fatal, but not immediately so. Theren dropped to his knees, his sword clattering to the floor, his hand moving to the wound that was rapidly staining his clothing red. Kadric stood over him, his blade still raised, his expression carved from winter stone. You were right about one thing, the Duke said quietly. I am becoming my father, just not the way you expected. Theren looked up at him, blood spreading across the floor, death approaching with inevitable certainty. What does that mean? It means I learned the wrong lesson. He taught me never to trust anyone, never show mercy, never let sentiment interfere with survival. And I spent years following that path until it left me with nothing except empty power. He lowered his sword slowly. So I tried being different, tried choosing humanity, tried trusting people. And you're right, it made me vulnerable. But you're wrong about what that means. His boot pressed against Theren's chest, forcing him flat against the blood-slicked floor. Being vulnerable doesn't make me weak. It makes me dangerous in ways you never understood. Because now I have something worth protecting, something worth killing for, something worth burning this entire castle down to defend. Theren coughed, blood appearing on his lips. She'll destroy you eventually. They always do. Maybe, Kadric agreed. But at least I'll die knowing I chose something beyond survival. He raised his sword one final time. Thank you for teaching me that lesson, even if you had to become a traitor to deliver it. The blade fell. Theren died on the floor of the corridor where he'd walked 1,000 times, where he'd served 3 generations of rulers, where he'd finally made the choice that transformed service into betrayal. Kadric stood over the body, breathing hard, covered in blood, feeling nothing except the cold calculation of what came next. The fighting at the gate had ended. His loyal troops had driven back the infiltrators. The breach was sealed. And throughout the castle, other conspirators were being rounded up, identified by the guards who'd observed the entire plot unfold. It was over, except it wasn't. Not really. Because the Chancellor's army still surrounded them. Because the siege would continue. Because surviving one betrayal didn't mean there wouldn't be others. And because Kadric had just killed the man who'd been more of a father to him than his actual father had ever been. And that kind of wound didn't heal just because it was necessary. He found Alara waiting in their chambers, exactly where he'd left her, surrounded by guards who hadn't participated in the conspiracy. She stood when he entered, taking in his appearance, the blood, the exhaustion. the look of someone who'd just crossed a line they couldn't uncross. "Is it done?" she asked quietly. "Yes." "Theren?" "Dead, along with most of the conspirators. The rest are in cells waiting for trial." Alara moved closer, her hand settling against his chest, feeling his heart pound beneath blood-soaked clothing. "Are you all right?" The question was absurd. Everything was wrong. The man he'd trusted most had tried to kill him. Half his command structure had been compromised. They were still under siege with no clear path to victory. And the only reason any of them were still alive was because Kaedric had become exactly the paranoid, brutal ruler he'd been trying not to be. But Alara wasn't asking about tactics or strategy or whether they'd survive the week. She was asking if he was human enough to feel the weight of what he'd just done. "No," Kaedric admitted. "I'm not all right. I just killed someone who raised me, who taught me everything about ruling, who was family in ways my actual family never was." He pulled away from her touch, walking to the window, staring out at the besieging army. And the worst part is that he was right. Showing mercy did make me vulnerable. Trusting you did create weakness. Every choice I made trying to be better gave my enemies exactly what they needed to try destroying me. "So what now?" Alara asked quietly. "Now we survive," Kaedric said flatly. "We outlast this siege. We destroy the Chancellor's army. We rebuild Blackthornne from whatever's left after this is over. And we accept that trying to be human doesn't change the fundamental truth of what ruling requires, which is violence, brutality, the willingness to kill anyone who threatens what you care about, even if they're people you love." He turned to face her, and his expression was raw in ways that made Alara's breath catch. "Theren thought you'd destroy me," he said. "Thought that caring about you was the weakness that would get me killed. And maybe he was right. Maybe this all ends with me dead because I chose sentiment over survival." His voice dropped even lower. "But I'd rather die human than live as the monster. Even if that makes me weak. Even if it gets me killed. Even if it means I fail at everything I was supposed to become." Alara crossed the room, her hands finding his face, forcing him to meet her eyes. "You're not weak," she said firmly. "You're not failing. And you're not your father or Theren or any of the other men who tried to beat humanity out of you. You're just someone trying very hard to survive without losing yourself in the process. And that's harder than being a monster. It's harder than ruling through fear alone. But it's also the only thing worth doing." Kaedric stared at her, this woman who'd survived assassination attempts and political conspiracies and now a full siege, and still somehow maintained faith that change was possible. "I don't know if I can do this," he admitted. "Be strong enough to rule and human enough to deserve it." "Then we figure it out together," Alara replied. "Because you're not alone anymore, even if that terrifies you." They stood together in the darkness, two people trying to build something stable on foundations that kept shifting beneath them, surrounded by enemies and uncertainty and the constant threat of violence. Outside, the siege continued. Inside, the bodies of conspirators were being removed from corridors. And throughout Blackthornne Keep, soldiers and servants and commanders who'd survived the night's betrayal tried to process what it meant that their most trusted advisor had tried to destroy them all. But in the Duke's chambers, behind locked doors and exhausted defenses, Kaedric and Alara simply held each other, two people choosing connection over isolation even when isolation was safer, choosing humanity over monstrosity even when monstrosity was simpler, choosing survival together over survival alone even when alone had better odds. And somewhere in that choice, despite the blood and betrayal and brutal reality of what ruling required, something fragile began taking root. Not hope, exactly. Hope was too optimistic for what they faced. But possibility. The slim chance that maybe, just maybe, they could survive this siege and build something afterward that was worth the cost of everything they'd sacrificed to get there. Or they'd die trying. Either way, they'd made their choice. And in the Empire, Kaedric had built on fear and possession, where survival meant never trusting anyone, and strength meant never showing weakness. That choice was the most dangerous thing either of them had ever done. The kind of dangerous that would either transform Blackthornne entirely or burn it to ash trying. And with the Chancellor's army still surrounding them, with winter settling deeper into the province, with enemies both external and potentially still internal, waiting for the next opportunity to strike, that transformation was coming faster than anyone expected, ready or not. The morning after Theren's death brought a silence to Blackthornne Keep that felt more ominous than any battle cry. Kedrick stood in the war room surrounded by the commanders who'd survived the purge. Half the strategic leadership had been conspirators. The other half were now staring at maps and supply reports with the grim understanding that their survival odds had just dropped catastrophically. Because they weren't just fighting the Chancellor's army anymore. They were fighting mathematics. Cold equations that said a fortress under siege could only hold as long as its people believed victory was possible. And when your most trusted advisor turns out to be a traitor, when half your command structure gets executed for conspiracy, belief becomes a luxury nobody can afford. "We have supplies for 6 more weeks," one of the surviving commanders said. His name was Marcus, a scarred veteran who'd fought in border wars before Caedric was born. After that, we start choosing between eating and staying warm. "The siege engines?" Caedric asked, still pounding the outer walls. "No breaches yet, but the southern curtain is showing stress fractures. Another week of sustained bombardment, and they'll have an opening." Another commander spoke up, younger, less experienced, but sharp enough to have earned his position through merit rather than inheritance. "What about the underground passages? Motwatsa, the old smuggler tunnels that connect to the sea caves?" "Collapsed during the last earthquake," Marcus replied. "We checked. Even if we could clear them, it would take weeks. We don't have weeks." Kedrick studied the map with eyes that burned from lack of sleep. Every strategic option led to the same conclusion. They were trapped, surrounded, running out of time and resources while an army that outnumbered them 3-1 waited patiently for starvation to do what their weapons hadn't managed yet. The smart play was surrender, negotiate terms, save as many lives as possible before the situation became completely unsalvageable. But surrender meant putting his head on a chopping block, meant watching Alara die beside him, meant proving that trying to be something other than a monster was just elaborate suicide wearing different clothes. And after everything he'd sacrificed, everyone he'd killed, every choice he'd made trying to balance strength with humanity, Caedric wasn't ready to accept that the only reward for growth was death. There was another option. Reckless. Probably suicidal. The kind of strategy that only made sense when you'd already accepted that conventional survival was off the table. He turned from the map, facing the assembled commanders with an expression that made several of them shift uncomfortably. "How many men do we have who can ride?" Caedric asked. Marcus frowned. "Maybe 200 cavalry. Why? And how many can fight on horseback? Experienced raiders who know how to hit fast and disappear? 100. Maybe 120. The commander's eyes widened as understanding began dawning. "Your Grace, you're not seriously considering—" "A sortie," Caedric interrupted. "At full force, right through their siege lines. Target their command structure. Kill the Chancellor personally. Decapitate their leadership before they realize what's happening. That's suicide," another commander said flatly. "Even if you breach their lines, they'll close behind you. You'll be trapped outside your own walls with their entire army between you and safety." Yes, the single word landed like a blade. Marcus leaned forward, his scarred hands pressing against the table. "Your Grace, if you die, Blackthornne falls. There's no succession, no clear authority. The entire province collapses into chaos." "I know. Then why—" "Because we're dying anyway," Caedric said quietly. "Slowly. Watching our supplies drain, waiting for walls to crack, hoping for rescue that isn't coming. Death by siege is still death. At least this way we choose the terms." He looked around at the faces staring at him. Men who'd survived decades of war, who'd seen kingdoms fall and empires burn, who understood tactics and strategy and the 100 different ways battles could be won or lost. Men who knew he was right, even though they desperately wanted him to be wrong. "If we wait, we lose," Caedric continued. "If we surrender, we lose. The only path that has any chance of survival is the one nobody expects. The one that's so reckless they won't see it coming until it's too late. And if it fails, then we die fighting instead of starving. I can live with that trade." The grim joke hung in the air for a moment before one of the commanders cracked something that might have been a smile. "When?" Marcus asked finally. "Tonight. During the storm that's been building all day. Low visibility, maximum chaos. We hit them when they're cold and miserable and thinking about anything except defending their command tent. That gives us maybe 8 hours to prepare. Then we'd better stop talking and start moving." The commanders dispersed, their faces showing the careful mix of fear and determination that came from accepting you were about to attempt something catastrophic. Cedric remained in the war room, staring at the map, calculating angles and odds, and the slim possibility that audacity could accomplish what strategy couldn't. He felt rather than heard Alara enter behind him. "You're planning something stupid," she said. "How did you know?" "Because you have the same expression you had right before you executed Vivien, like you're about to do something that can't be undone, and you're trying to convince yourself it's the right choice." Cedric turned to face her. This woman who'd become the center of everything he was trying to protect, who'd forced him to question every brutal lesson he'd learned about survival, who was currently looking at him with eyes that saw through every defense he'd ever built. "We're breaking the siege," he said. "Tonight. Full cavalry assault on the Chancellor's position. Kill him and hope his army collapses without leadership." "That's insane." "Yes. You'll be trapped outside the walls." "Probably. You could die. Almost certainly." Alara stared at him for a long moment. Then she did something that surprised them both. She smiled. Not happily. Not with any illusion about their odds. Just with the bitter understanding of someone who'd finally accepted that survival and safety were different things. "Then I'm coming with you." "Absolutely not." Her expression went flat. "Dangerous. You don't get to make that choice." "Yes, I do. I'm the Duke." "You're staying in the castle where it's relatively safe." "Relative to what?" she demanded. "If you die out there, the siege continues. The conspirators you didn't catch come out of hiding. And I'm still trapped in a castle that's slowly collapsing with enemies inside and outside the walls." She moved closer, her voice dropping but losing none of its steel. "At least if I'm with you, we die together. Or survive together, but I won't sit in a tower waiting to find out which." Cedric wanted to argue, wanted to pull rank and authority and every tool he'd ever used to enforce his will. But standing there looking at Alara, seeing that same defiant fire that had made him spare her life months ago, he realized something fundamental about the person he'd been trying to become. The monster would have locked her away, would have made the decision unilaterally, would have prioritized control over partnership. The man he was trying to be had to respect that she had just as much right to choose her death as he did. "Fine," he said roughly, "but you stay in the center of the formation, protected. And if things go wrong, you ride for the forest and don't look back. If things go wrong, we're all dead anyway." "Probably. But humor me." Alara's expression softened slightly. Then she reached up, her hand settling against his face, her thumb tracing the scar along his jaw. "We've come a long way from you executing my father," she said quietly. "Is that forgiveness?" "No. But it's acceptance and understanding, and the realization that the man who killed my father isn't the same man standing here trying to keep me safe." Cedric covered her hand with his, holding it against his face. "I don't know if people can actually change," he admitted, "or if we're all just pretending until the pressure gets high enough to crack the mask." "Maybe it doesn't matter," Alara replied. "Maybe what counts is that you keep trying even when it would be easier to stop." They stood together in the war room, surrounded by maps of battles yet to be fought, knowing that the next few hours would either validate everything they'd risked or prove that trying to be human in an inhumane world was just another form of elaborate suicide. Outside, the storm gathered strength. Wind howled through the castle corridors. Snow fell in sheets so thick the besieging army disappeared behind white curtains that made the world feel smaller, more intimate, like the universe had contracted to just this castle, this moment, these choices. Perfect conditions for madness masquerading as strategy. The afternoon passed in organized chaos. Cavalry assembled in the inner courtyard. Armor was checked, weapons sharpened, horses fed and watered and prepared for the kind of ride that would either end in glory or mass graves. Soldiers wrote letters they'd never send, made peace with whatever forces they believed governed the universe, accepted that sunset might be the last thing they ever saw. Cedric moved through the preparations like a shadow, checking every detail personally, making sure nothing was overlooked. Because in battles like this, survival wasn't about grand strategy or tactical brilliance. It was about small things. A properly fastened strap, a horse that wasn't lame, a soldier who understood the plan well enough to adapt when everything inevitably went wrong. He found Marcus near the stables, overseeing the final equipment checks. The older commander looked up, his scarred face showing resignation and grim determination in equal measure. "We're ready, Your Grace." As ready as men can be for suicide dressed up as cavalry tactics. Good. Remember the signal. 3 horn blasts. That's when the gates open. We go straight through, maximum speed, aim for the Chancellor's command position. Anyone who falls behind is on their own. Understood. Marcus hesitated. Then, it's been an honor serving you, even when you were being impossibly stubborn about changing into something that wasn't a complete bastard. Kadric almost smiled. Coming from you, that's practically poetry. Don't get sentimental on me now. We've still got a battle to survive. They clasped forearms in the warrior's grip. 2 men who'd fought together for years, who'd survived conspiracy and betrayal, and now were about to attempt something that would either be remembered as brilliant or idiotic, depending entirely on whether they lived long enough to write the history. Caedric continued his rounds, finding Alara near the armory being fitted with borrowed cavalry armor that was too large for her frame but would have to work anyway. She looked simultaneously terrified and determined, the same expression he'd seen the night she killed an assassin with broken glass. The look of someone who'd discovered what they were capable of when survival was the only option. "How does it feel?" he asked. "Like wearing a cage," she replied. "How do soldiers move in this?" "Practice. And the understanding that the alternative is dying." She adjusted the breastplate with visible discomfort. "I never thought I'd be preparing for battle. Daughter of a nobleman. Raised on poetry and court etiquette and all the useless accomplishments aristocratic women are supposed to master." Her eyes met his. "Turns out survival requires different skills than dancing." "You're doing fine. I killed a man with broken glass, Caedric. I'm wearing armor planning to ride into battle. I've watched you execute conspirators and political enemies, and I'm still here choosing this." "I'm not sure fine is the word I'd use." "What word would you use?" "Changed," she said quietly. "Fundamentally. Irreversibly. Into something I don't quite recognize but can't deny. Is that good or bad? I have no idea. Ask me if we survive the night." Caedric reached out, adjusting her armor properly, his hands moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd prepared for battle more times than he could count. "Stay close to me," he said. "When the fighting starts, it's going to be chaos. Noise and violence and terror. Your instinct will be to freeze or run. Fight that instinct. Keep moving. Keep your horse under control. And trust that the men around you know what they're doing. What if I panic? Then you panic. But keep riding anyway." "That's not particularly reassuring. It's not supposed to be reassuring. It's supposed to be honest." Alara studied his face. This man who'd killed her father, who'd tried to become something other than a monster, who was currently preparing to lead what amounted to a suicide charge with her beside him because she'd insisted on choosing her own death. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For not locking me in a tower. For respecting that I get to make stupid decisions too." Caedric's expression softened slightly. "We're partners. That means sharing the consequences, even when the consequences are probably fatal." They finished the armor fitting in silence, both of them acutely aware that this might be the last quiet moment they'd ever have. Twilight brought the storm to its peak. Wind screamed through Blackthornne Keep with enough force to rattle shutters and extinguish torches. Snow fell so thick that visibility dropped to maybe 30 feet. The besieging army huddled in their camps, miserable and cold, thinking about anything except the possibility that the defenders might be crazy enough to attack in weather that made cavalry charges borderline impossible, which was exactly what Caedric was counting on. He stood in the courtyard wearing full battle armor, his sword belted at his side, his black horse stamping impatiently beneath him. Around him, 120 riders assembled in formations that would mean nothing. The moment combat started but gave everyone something to focus on besides their own mortality. Marcus rode up beside him, his own armor scarred from decades of battles. "The men are ready, Your Grace." "Scared, but ready. Good." "Fear keeps you alive longer than courage. That's unusually cynical even for you. I'm about to lead a cavalry charge in a blizzard against an army 3 times our size." Cynicism feels appropriate. Fair point. Caedric looked around at the assembled riders, men who'd chosen to follow him into what was almost certainly death, soldiers who could have deserted or joined the conspirators, or found a dozen other ways to avoid this moment. Instead, they were here, armed and ready, waiting for the signal to charge into darkness. He should say something inspirational, give them a speech about honor and duty, and all the other lies commanders told soldiers before sending them to die. But inspiration was for men who believed survival was the likely outcome. These men deserved honesty. "Listen up," Kedrick called out, his voice cutting through the wind. "I'm not going to pretend this is anything other than what it is. We're outnumbered, we're desperate, and we're about to attempt something so reckless that military historians will either call it genius or the stupidest thing anyone's ever tried." A few grim chuckles rippled through the formation. "But here's what I know," he continued. "The Chancellor thinks he's won, thinks he can wait us out, starve us into submission. He's sitting in his command tent right now, warm and comfortable, planning how he'll execute me once we surrender." He raised his sword, the blade catching what little light penetrated the storm. "So we're going to ride through his lines. We're going to kill him in his tent. And we're going to prove that desperation makes men more dangerous than armies." More riders nodded, gripping weapons tighter. "If you fall, keep the man next to you fighting. If your horse goes down, take the nearest enemy with you. And if we die tonight, we die knowing we chose the terms instead of letting them choose for us." He lowered his sword, pointing toward the gates. "Now ride, and make the Chancellor regret ever thinking Blackthornne could be broken." The horn sounded. 3 long blasts that echoed across the courtyard despite the screaming wind. The gates opened, and 120 riders charged into winter darkness with nothing but momentum and desperation driving them forward. The initial breach was almost too easy. The besieging army's forward positions were undermanned, their sentries huddled against the storm, their attention focused on staying warm rather than watching for attacks nobody expected. Caedric's cavalry hit them like a hammer through glass, scattering pickets and crushing resistance before most soldiers even realized they were under attack. Horses thundered through snow-covered ground. Steel rang against steel in brief, brutal encounters that ended before they properly began. Caedric rode at the front, his sword finding targets with mechanical precision, his mind operating in that cold tactical space where emotion became irrelevant and survival was just a series of calculated movements. Beside him, slightly behind in the protected center of the formation, Alara rode with white-knuckled determination, her borrowed sword gripped in hands that shook from adrenaline rather than fear. The first organized resistance came 50 yards into the enemy camp. A unit of infantry formed defensive lines, spears raised, shields locked, trying to create a barrier that would stop the cavalry momentum. Smart tactics, the kind that worked in normal battles where horses refused to charge directly into steel. But Caedric wasn't leading a normal charge. He was leading men who'd already accepted death as the likely outcome, which meant they didn't slow, didn't hesitate, just crashed into the spear wall with enough force to shatter the formation. Horses screamed, men died. The defensive line collapsed into chaos as cavalry broke through, trampling survivors, and continuing the push deeper into the camp. Caedric felt something hot slice across his arm. Pain registered distantly but didn't slow him down. Just recalibrated his awareness that he was bleeding, still functional, and the target was somewhere ahead through the storm and darkness. A mounted enemy knight appeared from the right, lance lowered, aiming for Caedric's chest. The Duke twisted in his saddle, the lance passing close enough to feel wind, then brought his sword around in a strike that found the gap between helmet and armor. The knight dropped. His horse continued running, and Caedric kept moving forward because stopping meant dying, and dying meant Alara died, and that wasn't acceptable regardless of odds. Marcus appeared on his left, blood streaming from a cut on his face, his expression savage. "Command tent should be 100 yards ahead," he shouted over the wind. "But they know we're here now. The camp's waking up. Then we ride faster." They pushed deeper into enemy territory, fighting through increasingly organized resistance, watching their formation fragment as riders fell or got separated or found themselves surrounded by enemies who'd finally overcome their surprise. This was where the plan fell apart, where desperation met reality, where momentum crashed against superior numbers and tactics became irrelevant because there were simply too many enemies and not enough allies. Caedric could feel it happening, could see his cavalry getting picked apart by infantry who'd recovered from the initial shock, could calculate exactly how many heartbeats they had left before the charge became a massacre. But ahead, through the storm and darkness and chaos, he saw what they'd come for. The Chancellor's command tent, large enough to be visible even in the blizzard, guarded by elite troops who were currently scrambling to form defensive positions around their commander. Caedric pointed his bloody sword at the tent. "There! Break through and kill everyone inside." He spurred his horse forward, feeling rather than seeing the remaining riders following. knowing that this last push would either end with the Chancellor dead or their entire force annihilated. Probably both. The elite guards formed a shield wall directly in the charge path. Professional soldiers, well-trained, the kind who didn't panic or break even when cavalry came screaming at them through winter darkness. Behind them, the command tent flaps opened, and the Chancellor himself emerged, wearing armor and carrying a sword, his face twisted with fury and the understanding that impossible things were currently happening in his carefully planned siege. Cedric had one moment to appreciate the expression, one heartbeat to feel something like satisfaction that he'd successfully terrified the man who'd been so confident in victory. Then his horse hit the shield wall. The impact was catastrophic. The animal screamed and went down, throwing Cedric forward. He hit the ground hard enough to feel ribs crack, rolled through snow and mud and blood, came up with his sword still somehow in his hand. Around him, cavalry crashed into infantry in a tangle of horses and men and steel that was less battle and more mutual slaughter. No formations, no tactics, just violence concentrated in a space too small for anything resembling organization. Cedric saw Alara's horse go down 20 feet away, watched her hit the ground and roll exactly like he'd taught her that afternoon. Saw her come up with her sword raised, looking terrified and fierce, and absolutely determined not to die without taking someone with her. Then an enemy soldier moved between them, and Cedric lost sight of her in the chaos. He forced his way through the fighting, killing anyone who got close enough, his ribs screaming with each movement, blood from the earlier cut soaking his armor sleeve, his vision narrowing to just forward momentum, and the understanding that if he stopped moving, he'd die. And if he died, Alara died. And that single thought overrode pain and fear and tactical assessment. The Chancellor saw him coming, raised his sword in a guard position that showed training and skill, opened his mouth to give orders to his guards. Cedric hit him like winter thunder, sword high, all his momentum and weight and desperation concentrated into a strike designed to break through whatever defense stood in his way. Their blades met with a sound like breaking bones. The Chancellor was good, better than good. He'd clearly trained with the kingdom's finest sword masters, knew how to control distance and timing and leverage. Under normal circumstances, in a proper duel with rules and structure, he probably would have been the better fighter. But these weren't normal circumstances, and Cedric wasn't fighting a duel. He was fighting for survival in an environment where rules meant nothing. And the only thing that mattered was who stayed standing when the violence ended. They exchanged strikes in the space between heartbeats. The Chancellor defending with precision, Cedric attacking with the kind of brutality that came from years of surviving in places where second place meant death. Around them, the battle continued, riders fighting dismounted infantry, cavalry being overwhelmed by sheer numbers, the charge fragmenting completely as what little coordination remained dissolved into individual struggles for survival. Cedric saw Marcus go down under 3 soldiers, watched other riders fall, felt his force being systematically destroyed by an enemy that had recovered from surprise and was now applying overwhelming numerical advantage. They'd failed. The charge was collapsing, and in minutes every man who'd followed him would be dead or captured. But the Chancellor was right here, right in front of him, separated from most of his guards by the chaos of combat. If Cedric could kill him before his own death, maybe the enemy army would fracture. Maybe Blackthornne would survive even if its duke didn't. It was a slim hope, but it was the only one available. He pressed his attack, ignoring the pain in his ribs, ignoring the blood loss, ignoring everything except the need to land one killing blow before his strength failed completely. The Chancellor blocked, parried, counterattacked with a strike that would have opened Cedric's throat if he hadn't twisted away at the last instant. They were both breathing hard now, both bleeding, both understanding that this fight was approaching its conclusion and only one of them would walk away. Then Alara appeared from the chaos like something avenging. She crashed into the Chancellor from his blind side, her borrowed sword stabbing upward through a gap in his armor, the blade finding flesh beneath steel. The Chancellor screamed, stumbled, his sword dropping from nerveless fingers. Cedric didn't hesitate, didn't give him time to recover, just brought his own blade around in a strike that took the man's head clean off his shoulders. The body dropped, blood sprayed across snow already stained red. And the Chancellor who'd besieged Blackthornne, who'd united 6 noble houses against them, who'd been so certain of victory, died in the mud of his own camp without ceremony or final words. For a moment, the fighting around them paused. enemy soldiers staring at their commander's headless corpse, riders staring at the same thing, everyone processing what had just happened. Then the enemy forces erupted into chaos. Some tried to maintain their attack. Others broke and ran. A few attempted to organize a retreat, but without leadership, without clear command structure, an army became just a collection of individuals making independent decisions about whether survival or vengeance mattered more. Cedric grabbed Alara, pulling her close, checking for injuries even as his own body screamed in protest. "Are you hurt?" She was covered in blood and breathing like she'd been running for miles but seemed functional. "Not mine," she gasped. "The blood. It's not mine." "Good, we need to move. Now, before they reorganize." "Where?" He looked around at the fragmenting battle, at riders who were still alive but scattered, at enemy forces that were collapsing into confusion but still outnumbered them catastrophically. "The castle," he said. "We ride back. Before they figure out what happened and close the escape route." A horn sounded in the distance. The signal to retreat. Marcus if he was still alive. Someone else if he wasn't. Surviving riders began fighting their way toward the sound, abandoning the enemy camp, focused solely on reaching safety before the army recovered enough to trap them outside the walls. Cedric found a riderless horse, helped Alara mount, then climbed up behind her because his own mount was dead somewhere in the carnage, and there was no time to be picky about transportation. They rode through winter darkness with an army fragmenting around them, the storm still raging, visibility nearly zero, survival measured in heartbeats and the slim hope that they could reach the gates before everything fell apart completely. Behind them, what remained of the Chancellor's forces began pursuing, not organized, not coordinated, just angry men seeking revenge against enemies who'd killed their commander. Ahead, barely visible through the blizzard, the torches of Blackthornne Keep appeared like salvation made of fire. The gates stood open, defenders on the walls providing covering fire for returning riders. The fortress preparing to seal itself once everyone who could make it back had made it back. Cedric counted horses as they thundered past. 70, maybe 80, out of the 120 who'd charged. The rest were dead or captured or lost in the storm. Sacrifices made for a gamble that had somehow, impossibly, worked. They crossed the threshold. The gates began closing immediately, and Cedric finally allowed himself to believe they might actually survive the night. He slid off the horse, his legs nearly giving out, pain from his ribs and arm, and a dozen other injuries finally registering now that immediate survival wasn't consuming all his attention. Alara dismounted beside him, her face pale beneath the blood and mud, her hands shaking from adrenaline crash. "We did it," she whispered. "We actually did it." Cedric looked at her, at this woman who'd charged into battle beside him, who'd killed the Chancellor when the opportunity appeared, who'd survived against odds that should have killed them both. "Yes," he said quietly, "we did." Then his legs actually did give out, and he collapsed against the horse, the world spinning as blood loss and exhaustion finally overwhelmed whatever reserve of strength had been keeping him upright. The last thing he saw before darkness took him was Alara reaching for him, her voice calling his name, and the understanding that they'd won the battle but the war was far from over. Because outside the walls, an army without a leader was still an army, and anger combined with chaos was often more dangerous than organized aggression. They'd killed the Chancellor, broken the siege command structure, bought themselves time. But time wasn't victory. It was just the space between one crisis and the next. And in that space, Blackthornne Keep stood wounded and defiant, its duke unconscious, its defenders exhausted, and its future balanced on the knife edge between triumph and total annihilation. The storm continued raging outside. Inside, servants and soldiers worked frantically to treat the wounded and prepare defenses for whatever came next. And somewhere in the chaos, Alara knelt beside Cedric's unconscious body, holding his hand, refusing to let go even as healers swarmed around them, trying to assess how badly the Duke was injured. Because they'd survived this far by choosing each other over isolation, by refusing to surrender even when surrender was the logical choice, by committing to the insane possibility that strength and humanity could coexist if you were willing to pay the price in blood and pain and sacrifice. And that commitment was about to be tested one final time, because dawn was coming, and with it, the enemy army's response to their commander's death. Either they'd fracture completely and the siege would end, or they'd unite in rage and launch a final assault that would determine whether Blackthornne Keep stood or fell. The next few hours would answer that question, and whatever answer came, Cedric and Alara would face it together. If he woke up. If she could keep him alive long enough to find out if their impossible gamble had actually worked. If survival was even still possible after everything they'd sacrificed to get here. The storm screamed against the walls. Inside, Blackthornne held its breath, and the night stretched toward dawn with the weight of empires hanging in the balance. Cedric woke to pain that felt like his entire body was rejecting the concept of consciousness. Everything hurt. His ribs where the horse had thrown him, his arm where the blade had opened flesh, his head where exhaustion and blood loss had combined into something that felt like his skull was splitting from the inside. Even breathing was an exercise in controlled agony, each inhale reminding him that survival came with a price tag written in damaged tissue and trauma. He opened his eyes to find himself in his chambers, morning light filtering through windows that showed a sky finally clear of the storm that had raged for days. The sight was disorienting, beautiful and wrong simultaneously, like the world had decided to pretend nothing catastrophic had happened while his body still carried evidence to the contrary. Alara sat in a chair beside the bed, her head tilted against the wall, eyes closed in exhausted sleep. She was still wearing the blood-stained tunic from the battle, her borrowed armor discarded in a pile near the door. Even unconscious, she looked exhausted in ways that went deeper than physical fatigue, the kind of bone-deep weariness that came from surviving things that should have killed you and discovering the survival hurt worse than you'd expected. Cedric tried to sit up. His ribs screamed in protest, a sharp, hot pain that made the room spin and his vision narrow to a tunnel of agony, punctuated by the understanding that several bones were definitely cracked, if not broken completely. The movement woke Alara. Her eyes snapped open, immediately focusing on him with an intensity that suggested she'd been listening for any sign of consciousness, even in sleep. "Don't move," she said, her voice hoarse. "The healer said your ribs are fractured. 3 of them. And you lost enough blood that you should probably be dead. How long have I been unconscious?" 2 days. The information landed like a physical blow. 2 days. Anything could have happened in 2 days. The siege could have resumed. The enemy army could have reorganized. Blackthornne could have fallen while he was lying here useless and broken. "What happened?" Cedric asked roughly. "The siege. The army. Did they—" "They're gone," Alara interrupted. "The Chancellor's forces. After you killed him, they fractured completely. Some units tried to maintain the siege. Others retreated. Most just dissolved into smaller groups arguing about who was in charge now." She stood, moving to pour water from a pitcher on the side table, bringing it to him carefully. By yesterday morning, the entire army had withdrawn. Not surrendered, not negotiated, just left. Like a structure that lost its foundation and couldn't figure out how to stay standing. Cedric took the water, drinking slowly despite wanting to drain the entire cup. His throat felt like sandpaper and broken glass combined. "Casualties?" he asked. 43 riders dead. Another 20 wounded badly enough that they might not recover. Marcus survived. Lost an eye, but he's already back on duty pretending it's just a minor inconvenience. A grim smile crossed Cedric's face despite the pain. "That sounds like Marcus. The rest of the castle is intact. No breaches. Supplies are low but manageable now that we're not under siege. And the conspiracy seems to have died with Theren. No more attempts on my life. No more secret meetings in hidden chambers." She set the empty cup aside, then settled back into the chair, her eyes never leaving his face. "We survived," she said quietly. "Against every odd, against every tactical assessment, against everything that should have gotten us killed. We actually survived." The word should have felt triumphant, victorious. Instead, they settled into Cedric's chest with the weight of something complicated and heavy. Because survival wasn't the same as victory. It was just the space where you got to contemplate the cost of still breathing. "How many people died for that survival?" he asked. "How many soldiers followed me into a suicidal charge because I was desperate enough to gamble their lives on a strategy that barely worked?" Alara was quiet for a moment, then, "They were going to die anyway. Slowly. From starvation or disease or the walls eventually cracking. You gave them a chance to die fighting for something instead of withering away in a siege. That's not comfort. It's not supposed to be. It's just truth." She leaned forward, her elbows resting on her knees, her expression showing exhaustion and determination in equal measure. "You're trying to carry guilt for choices that weren't really choices. The siege was going to end one way or another. At least this way we got to decide the terms. At least this way Blackthorne still stands. At what cost? The same cost everything worth having requires, Alara replied. Blood, pain, sacrifice, the willingness to make decisions that haunt you afterward. That's what ruling is. That's what surviving is. And you don't get to pretend otherwise just because you tried being something other than a monster. The words hit harder than any physical blow. Kaedric stared at her. This woman who'd lost her father to his brutality, who'd survived assassination attempts and conspiracies and a siege that should have killed everyone inside these walls, who was currently looking at him with eyes that saw through every defense and excuse and desperate rationalization he'd tried building around his choices. I executed your father, he said quietly. Killed Vivien, destroyed Theren, led men into battles where most of them died. I've left a trail of corpses behind me that stretches back years. And you're sitting here telling me that's just the cost of ruling? No, Alara said. I'm telling you that's the cost of trying to rule with both strength and conscience. Monsters don't carry guilt. They don't question their choices. They don't lie awake at night wondering if there was another way. She reached out, her hand settling over his. The fact that you're asking these questions means you're not your father. Means you're not Theren. Means you're exactly what Blackthorne needs, even if it's harder than being what it had before. Kaedric looked down at their joined hands, hers small and scarred from recent violence, his larger, marked by decades of survival in environments that rewarded brutality over compassion. Two people who should have been enemies, who'd somehow become partners, who'd built something fragile and improbable on foundations made of blood and trauma and the slim hope that change was actually possible. I don't know if I can keep doing this, he admitted, making impossible choices. Watching people die for my decisions, trying to balance strength with humanity when every instinct says one destroys the other. Then don't do it alone, Alara replied. What? You've spent your entire life thinking survival meant isolation, that trusting anyone was weakness, that carrying everything yourself was the only way to stay in control. But that's not strength. That's just fear wearing different clothes. She squeezed his hand gently. Let me help carry it. Let the people who survived the siege help. Stop pretending that being strong means never showing the weight of what you're carrying. The suggestion should have triggered every defense mechanism Kaedric had spent years building. Should have made him retreat behind walls of control and self-sufficiency. Should have proven that letting anyone see vulnerability was just another path to betrayal. Instead, it felt like something breaking open inside his chest. Not painfully. More like ice cracking after a long winter, revealing water underneath that could finally move again. I don't know how, he said roughly. Neither do I, Alara admitted. But we figure it out together, same way we figured out everything else. By making mistakes and learning and refusing to give up even when giving up would be easier. Outside the windows, Blackthorne province was waking to its first day without siege. Servants moved through corridors. Guards patrolled walls that no longer faced immediate threat. The machinery of daily life resumed with the hesitant awkwardness of something that had forgotten what normal felt like. Kaedric lay in his bed, broken and healing, trying to process what survival actually meant now that the immediate crisis had passed. Trying to understand what came next for a duke who'd spent years building power through fear and was now attempting something infinitely harder. Building it through trust. The following weeks passed in organized reconstruction. The castle needed repairs. The province needed reassurance. Noble families who'd stayed neutral during the siege suddenly remembered their loyalty and sent letters of support that arrived too late to matter, but early enough to position themselves for whatever came next. Kaedric recovered slowly, his ribs knitting back together with the agonizing patience of bone healing. He spent his days in the war room reviewing reports and making decisions. His nights in chambers with Alara, both of them trying to figure out how to exist in a world that wasn't actively trying to kill them. It was harder than the siege in some ways. At least during combat, the objectives were clear. Survive. Kill your enemies. Don't die. Simple mathematics of violence, where success was measured in whether your heart kept beating. Peace required different skills. Patience. Compromise. The ability to hold multiple contradictory truths simultaneously and find ways to build something functional from the chaos. Kaedric discovered he was terrible at it. 3 weeks after the battle, He stood in the great hall listening to petitioners argue about property disputes and trade agreements and a dozen other mundane concerns that felt absurdly trivial after everything they'd survived. His ribs still ached when he breathed. His arm where the blade had cut him was healing but left visible reminders every time he caught sight of the scar. And his patience for aristocratic nonsense had worn through completely. Lord Ashton and Lady Meredith were arguing about a boundary line between their estates. Something about a stream changing course and whether the original property markers still applied. Both of them were red-faced and furious, voices rising as they presented their cases with the passion of people who'd never faced actual hardship. Cedric listened for exactly 30 seconds before interrupting. "Here's my judgment," he said flatly. "The stream is the boundary. Wherever it flows now is where your property lines sit. Adjust your maps accordingly. If you don't like it, you're welcome to dig a new channel and redirect the water, but I'm done listening to grown adults argue about geography." Both nobles stared at him, shocked at the abruptness. "But your grace," Lord Ashton began, "the traditional markers are irrelevant," Cedric interrupted. "The stream moved. Nature doesn't care about tradition. Adapt or don't. Those are your options." He gestured to the guards. "Next petitioner." The nobles withdrew, grumbling but unwilling to push their complaint further against a duke who looked like he was approximately 3 seconds from ordering executions for annoying him. Elara watched from her position beside the throne, something between amusement and concern crossing her face. "You're not making friends," she said quietly once the hall had cleared for a mid-morning break. "I have friends. Fair point. But you might want to consider that ruling during peacetime requires different skills than ruling during siege." Cedric stood from the throne, his ribs protesting the movement, his entire body reminding him that recovery was a process rather than an event. "I'm a weapon," he said roughly, "designed and trained for violence, for surviving in environments where mercy gets you killed. But sitting here listening to people complain about property lines while we're still burying soldiers who died 3 weeks ago?" He shook his head. "I don't know how to care about the first thing when the second thing is still raw." Elara moved closer, her voice dropping so only he could hear. "Then learn. Because Blackthornne needs both versions of you. The warrior who can lead cavalry charges through blizzards, and the ruler who can settle boundary disputes without executing anyone. That's asking for 2 different people." "No, it's asking you to be complete instead of just functional." She reached up, her hand settling against his face, her thumb tracing the scar along his jaw that had been there so long he barely remembered how he'd gotten it. "You spent years cutting away everything except survival instinct. Everything that made you vulnerable, or soft, or human. And you're right, that made you strong. But it also made you lonely. And now you have a choice about whether you want to stay that way." Cedric covered her hand with his, holding it against his face. "What if I don't know how to be anything else? Then we figure it out together. Same way we figured out everything else." The pattern was becoming familiar. Every time Cedric hit a wall or faced something he didn't understand, Elara offered partnership instead of answers. It should have been frustrating. Instead, it felt like something slowly teaching him that not everything had to be conquered or controlled. Some things just had to be survived together until they transformed into something manageable. That afternoon, Cedric made a decision that would have been unthinkable 6 months ago. He called a council meeting, not with commanders or military advisors, with representatives from across Blackthornne province. Merchants, farmers, craftsmen, people who'd lived through the siege and had opinions about what came next. The kind of people his father would have dismissed as irrelevant. The kind of voices that didn't matter in a system built on aristocratic authority and fear-based compliance. Cedric sat at the head of the council table, Elara beside him, and looked at the dozen faces staring back with varying degrees of nervousness and suspicion. "You survived a siege," he said without preamble. "You watched your duke lead a suicidal cavalry charge. You buried friends and family who died defending these walls. So now I want to know what you think we should do next." Silence greeted the question. The kind of stunned quiet that came from people who'd never expected their duke to ask for input rather than simply issuing orders. Finally, an older merchant spoke up, his voice careful but steady. "The trade routes need securing, Your Grace. The siege disrupted supply chains across the entire northern region. If we don't reestablish them quickly, the economic damage will outlast the military conflict." A farmer cleared her throat nervously. "And the fields need workers. We lost sons and husbands in the fighting. Next planting season, we won't have enough hands to work the land." Unless something changes, we're looking at food shortages come autumn. One by one, the representatives shared concerns and suggestions and perspectives that Kadric would never have considered, because he'd spent his entire life thinking about power from the top down rather than the bottom up. It was uncomfortable, challenging, required listening to criticism and acknowledging limitations in ways that felt dangerously close to admitting weakness. But it was also honest, real. The kind of governance that treated people like partners rather than subjects. By the time the meeting ended, Kadric had pages of notes and a splitting headache and the uncomfortable understanding that ruling effectively was infinitely more complex than ruling through fear. Elara found him afterward in the war room, staring at his notes with an expression that suggested he was questioning every choice that had led to this moment. "That bad?" she asked. "That different?" Kadric replied. "I've spent years making decisions based on what kept me in power, what made enemies fear me, what ensured survival through strength. And now I'm trying to figure out how to make decisions based on what actually helps the people living here. And it turns out those aren't always the same thing." He looked up at her. "My father would have called this weakness. Theren would have said I was abandoning the principles that made Blackthornne strong. Half the nobility probably thinks I've lost my mind. What do you think?" Kadric was quiet for a long moment, studying his notes, thinking about farmers who needed workers, and merchants who needed trade routes, and all the mundane complexities of governance that violence couldn't solve. "I think," he said finally, "that maybe strength isn't just about making people fear you. Maybe it's also about making them believe you're actually trying to make things better." That sounds dangerously close to hope. "Don't push it. I'm barely managing cynical optimism." Elara smiled, and it was genuine warmth rather than the bitter amusement that had characterized most of their interactions for months. "I'll take it," she said. Spring came to Blackthornne province like a promise the world wasn't sure it could keep. Snow melted from the cliffs. The northern sea calmed from winter fury to something merely dangerous rather than catastrophically lethal. Green appeared in places that had been white or brown for months, tentative but real. Evidence that seasons changed regardless of human violence. The castle underwent transformations both physical and philosophical. Walls were repaired, damaged sections rebuilt. But more than that, the atmosphere shifted. Servants no longer flinched when footsteps echoed through corridors. Guards smiled occasionally instead of maintaining rigid military discipline. The oppressive silence that had defined Blackthornne for generations began fracturing, replaced by something that almost resembled normal human interaction. Kadric watched it happen with mixed feelings. Part of him appreciated the change, recognized that fear-based control created brittle systems that collapsed under pressure. Understood intellectually that building loyalty through respect rather than terror was strategically superior long-term. But another part, the part forged by his father's fists and years of survival in brutal environments, screamed that relaxation was just another word for vulnerability waiting to be exploited. He stood on the balcony overlooking the province one evening as sunset painted the sky in colors that looked like fire reflected in water. Elara appeared beside him, wearing a dress that actually fit her now, rather than borrowed armor or clothing designed for someone else. She'd changed in the months since arriving at Blackthornne, lost the hollowed-out grief that had characterized her early imprisonment, gained confidence and steel that came from surviving things that should have broken her. She looked like someone who'd discovered exactly what she was capable of and had made peace with that knowledge even when it wasn't comfortable. "What are you thinking?" she asked quietly. "That I don't recognize this place anymore," Kadric replied. Blackthornne used to be defined by fear, by the understanding that weakness meant death and mercy was suicide. But now people are laughing in the corridors. Servants make eye contact. Guards tell jokes during shift changes. Is that bad? No, but it's strange. Like watching something I built transform into something I didn't plan. Elara moved closer, her shoulder touching his. "Maybe that's growth," she said. "Maybe the things we build are supposed to evolve beyond our original intentions. Otherwise, we're just creating monuments to our own limitations." Kadric glanced at her. "You sound like you've been reading philosophy." "I've been reading your father's journals," she admitted. "The ones in the private library. Trying to understand what made him the way he was. What turned him into someone who thought brutality was the only path to strength. And what did you find?" "Fear," Elara said quietly. "Page after page of it. disguised as philosophy and strategy and all the justifications people create when they're trying to explain why cruelty is necessary. But underneath, it was just terror of being weak, of being vulnerable, of being human. She turned to face him fully. He spent his entire life running from that fear, and he passed it down to you like inheritance. The belief that showing anything except strength was the same as inviting destruction. Caedric's jaw tightened. That belief kept me alive. Yes, Alara agreed, but it also made you miserable and lonely, and so convinced that trust was weakness that you almost got killed by the person you trusted most. She reached out, her hand finding his. Your father was wrong about strength, about survival, about what it takes to actually build something worth protecting. And you get to choose whether you keep following his path or forge your own. The sun continued sinking toward the horizon, light fading from gold to orange to deep crimson that looked like blood or fire depending on interpretation. Caedric stood with Alara on the balcony, overlooking a province that was slowly transforming from something built on fear into something that might eventually resemble hope, and made the choice that would define everything that came after. I want to try, he said quietly. I don't know if I can actually change, don't know if years of conditioning can be undone. But I want to try building something here that isn't just held together by terror. Alara's grip on his hand tightened. Then try. And when you fail, because you will fail sometimes, don't treat it like evidence that change is impossible. Treat it like information about what doesn't work and adjust. That sounds exhausting. Welcome to being human. It's exhausting, but it's also the only thing worth doing. They stood together as darkness gathered. Two people who'd survived conspiracy and siege and betrayal, trying to figure out what came next when survival stopped being the only goal. The answer, they were slowly discovering, was infinitely more complex and challenging than either had anticipated. Because destroying was easy. Any fool with power could tear things down, build empires on fear, rule through violence and intimidation. Creating something worth preserving required different skills entirely. Required patience and compromise and the willingness to be wrong sometimes. Required treating people like partners rather than subjects. Required believing that change was possible even when every instinct said otherwise. It required being human, fully, messily, with all the vulnerability and complication that entailed. And for Caedric, who'd spent years learning to be anything except human, that was the hardest battle he'd ever faced. 1 year later, Blackthornne province looked like a different world. Trade routes that had been disrupted by the siege were flowing again. Fields that had gone fallow were producing crops. The economy that had been strangled by war was recovering with the resilient stubbornness of systems that refused to die just because they'd been damaged. The castle itself had been rebuilt in ways both literal and metaphorical. Physical structures repaired. But more than that, the culture had shifted. Blackthornne Keep was still a fortress. Still maintained defensive capability that made it one of the most secure locations in the kingdom. But it had also become something else, a place where people chose to serve rather than being forced, where loyalty came from respect rather than fear, where the Duke's authority was grounded in competence and fairness rather than the threat of violence. It wasn't perfect. Nothing involving humans ever was. There were still disputes and injustices and moments when Caedric's old instincts screamed to solve problems through brutality rather than process. But it was better, measurably, objectively, in ways that even the most cynical observers couldn't deny. Caedric stood in the Great Hall on the anniversary of the siege's end, addressing the assembled province. Representatives from every corner of Blackthornne had gathered, not because they were forced, because they'd been invited to participate in decisions about their own future. The concept would have been unthinkable under his father's rule, under Theren's guidance, under the old system where power flowed only downward and dissent was crushed before it could spread. But Caedric had learned something crucial in the years since the Chancellor's death, something that contradicted everything he'd been taught about strength and survival. Control maintained through fear was brittle. The moment pressure exceeded the breaking point, it shattered completely. But control maintained through partnership, through genuine investment in collective success, was resilient, flexible, capable of adapting to pressures that would have destroyed more rigid systems. He'd spent years building an empire on fear, and he'd nearly lost everything when that empire's foundations cracked. Now he was trying to build something different, something that might actually last beyond his own lifetime. "We survived the siege," he said to the gathered crowd, his voice carrying through the hall that had seen so much violence and transformation. "We survived conspiracy. We survived winter and starvation and enemies who thought isolation would break us." He paused, his eyes moving across faces that ranged from scarred soldiers to farmers to merchants, to nobles who'd stayed loyal through the worst of it. "And we did it not because I ruled through fear, not because people obeyed out of terror, but because we chose to survive together, because we decided that what we were protecting was worth the cost." His hand found Alara's where she stood beside him, her presence a constant reminder of everything that had changed and everything worth preserving. "So now I'm asking you to make another choice, to help build something here that isn't just about survival, something that's actually worth living for. A province where strength comes from partnership rather than domination, where justice matters more than revenge, where people can thrive instead of just enduring." He looked directly at the crowd. "I can't do it alone, and I'm done pretending that trying to carry everything myself is strength, so I'm asking for help, for input, for the understanding that we're all in this together." The speech would have made his father sick. Theren would have called it weakness masquerading as leadership. Half the old guard probably thought he'd lost his mind, but the applause that followed was genuine. Not the fearful compliance of subjects afraid to displease their ruler. The real approval of people who'd been invited to participate in something larger than themselves. And watching that response, feeling Alara's hand in his, seeing evidence that change was actually possible when you committed to it fully, Cedric finally understood something his father had never learned. True strength wasn't about making people fear you. It was about making them believe you were worth following, even when following was difficult. That evening, after the formalities ended and the crowds dispersed, Cedric and Alara walked through the castle gardens that had been replanted during spring. The northern sea crashed against cliffs in the distance. Stars appeared overhead as twilight faded into proper darkness. The province settled into night with the comfortable routine of a place that had learned to exist without constant crisis. "We did it," Alara said quietly. "Built something that isn't just held together by violence. Did we? Or are we just in the calm before the next storm? Probably both. But that's life. There's always another storm coming. The question is whether you waste the calm periods worrying about future disasters or actually use them to build something worth protecting." Cedric stopped walking, turning to face her fully. This woman who'd survived his brutality and somehow transformed it into something resembling redemption, who'd challenged him at every step, who'd refused to let him hide behind excuses or rationalizations, or the justifications he'd used to defend his worst choices. "I love you," he said. The words felt foreign on his tongue, uncomfortable, like admitting something that made him vulnerable in ways combat never did, but also true, undeniably, completely. Alara's expression softened in ways that made her look both younger and impossibly wise simultaneously. "I know," she said. "You've been showing me for months, with every difficult choice. Every time you chose partnership over control. Every moment you let me see the person beneath the Duke's mask." She reached up, her hand settling against his face in the gesture that had become familiar. "I love you too," she continued, "even though you killed my father. Even though you represent everything I was raised to oppose. Even though loving you means accepting that the world is more complicated than I ever wanted to believe." Her thumb traced the scar along his jaw. "You're not a good man, Cedric. You've done terrible things, hurt people, made choices that haunt you. And you're going to keep making difficult choices because that's what ruling requires. But you're trying. And that's more than most people with power ever manage." They stood together in the garden, surrounded by new growth and the evidence of transformation. Two people who'd built something improbable from the wreckage of everything they'd lost. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. There was no magical resolution where all the pain disappeared or the past stopped mattering. Cedric would always carry the weight of what he'd done. Alara would always carry the loss of her family. The province would always bear scars from the siege and the conspiracy and the years of brutal rule that preceded the change. But scars were just evidence of survival, proof that damage didn't have to be terminal. And in a world where most people never bothered trying to be better than their worst instincts, the willingness to bear those scars while still moving forward was its own form of victory. 6 months later, in a ceremony attended by representatives from across the kingdom, Duke Cedric Blackthornne married Lady Alara Ashford in the same great hall where he'd once executed her father. The symbolism was intentional, uncomfortable. a public acknowledgement that transformation required confronting the past rather than pretending it never happened. Some nobles boycotted, calling it an insult to tradition and proper mourning. Others attended out of curiosity or political necessity. But many came because they'd seen the changes in Blackthornne province and wanted to understand how brutality had transformed into something resembling functional governance. The ceremony itself was simple. No elaborate displays of wealth or power, just two people making promises in front of witnesses who understood exactly how unlikely this moment had seemed a year ago. Cedric stood at the altar wearing formal attire that felt constraining after months of preferring practical clothing. Elara approached and addressed the color of winter sky, her expression showing determination and something that might have been joy beneath the complicated weight of everything that had led to this moment. They faced each other while an officiant recited traditional vows, words about partnership and loyalty and choosing each other above all others, standard ceremony language that felt simultaneously inadequate and perfectly accurate. When the officiant finished, Cedric spoke the words he'd prepared. Not flowery speeches or romantic declarations, just honesty stripped of everything except what mattered. "I'm not offering you a perfect life," he said. "I'm not promising to never make mistakes or hurt you or fail at being the person you deserve. What I'm offering is partnership, the promise that we face everything together, that your voice matters as much as mine, that we build something here worth protecting even when protecting it is difficult." He reached for her hands, holding them carefully. "You forced me to become better than I was, and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to deserve that." Elara's eyes were bright with emotion she'd learned to show rather than hide. "I'm not offering you redemption," she replied. "I can't erase what you've done or absolve the choices you've made. What I'm offering is acceptance, the understanding that people are complicated, that strength and weakness coexist, that transformation is possible even for men who thought they were beyond changing." Her grip on his hands tightened. "You showed me that power doesn't have to mean cruelty, and I'll spend the rest of my life helping you remember that when the old patterns try pulling you backward." The vows were witnessed and binding. The ceremony concluded, and Duchess Elara Blackthornne stood beside her husband in the hall where her father had died, choosing deliberately to build something new from the ashes of everything that had been destroyed. It was complicated, messy, the kind of union that would never fit neatly into stories about heroes and villains, because real people existed in the uncomfortable space between those extremes. But it was real, genuine, built on the understanding that love wasn't about finding someone perfect. It was about finding someone worth the difficult work of building something sustainable together. Years passed. Blackthornne province continued transforming. The changes weren't dramatic, no sudden revolution or overnight miracle, just steady, incremental improvements, better trade agreements, fair justice systems, investment in infrastructure and education, and all the mundane things that determined whether people thrived or just survived. Cedric remained Duke, still made difficult decisions, still occasionally resorted to brutality when situations required it, because the world hadn't suddenly become gentle just because he'd tried changing. But the brutality was tempered now, constrained by process and accountability rather than unlimited by his own discretion. He'd learned to seek input before making major decisions, to accept criticism without treating it as personal attack, to admit when he was wrong and adjust course accordingly. It was exhausting, infinitely harder than ruling through fear had ever been, required constant vigilance against old patterns and instincts that whispered that control through terror was simpler and more reliable. But it was also better. Not perfect. Never perfect. Just better than what had been before. Elara became more than ceremonial duchess. She established schools and hospitals, reformed legal codes that had been unchanged for generations, created systems that gave people recourse against injustice, instead of just accepting that power meant immunity from consequences. She argued with Cedric frequently, challenged his decisions, refused to defer to his authority when she thought he was wrong. And gradually, the province learned that dissent wasn't the same as disloyalty, that partnership included disagreement, that strength came from multiple perspectives rather than singular vision. They had children eventually, 3 of them. 2 boys and a girl who grew up in a Blackthornne keep that looked nothing like the fortress where Cedric had been raised. They knew their father's history, knew he'd done terrible things before they were born, but they also saw him try every day to be better than that history, to build something worth inheriting rather than just maintaining power through force. It wasn't a perfect family, There were arguments and mistakes and moments when old trauma surfaced and required working through. But it was functional, real, the kind of complicated humanity that actually existed rather than the sanitized version people preferred in stories. On the 20th anniversary of the siege, Caedric stood on the same balcony where he'd once contemplated everything he'd built through fear and looked at a province that bore little resemblance to what had existed before. Elara found him there, gray threading through her dark hair now, her face marked by years but still showing the same steel that had made her survive when survival seemed impossible. "Thinking about the past?" she asked. "Always," Caedric replied. "Hard not to when the past is what made everything else possible. Do you regret it? The path you chose? Trying to be something other than the monster?" "Every day," he admitted, and not at all simultaneously. He turned to face her, his own face marked by scars and age and the weight of decades spent trying to balance strength with humanity. "I lost people I cared about, made choices that still haunt me, carried guilt that will never fully resolve. But I also built something here that might actually outlast me, something my children can inherit without having to become monsters themselves to maintain it." He reached for her hand, holding it with the same careful attention he'd learned years ago. "So, no, I don't regret it, even though it was harder than anything I've ever done, even though it cost more than I expected, even though I'll never fully escape what I was before." Elara leaned against him, both of them watching sunset paint the province in colors that looked like hope, reflected in reality. "That's growth," she said quietly, "carrying the weight without letting it crush you, acknowledging damage without being defined by it, building forward while remembering backward." "We did it together," Caedric reminded her. "I would have failed alone. Maybe. But you chose to try. That's what mattered." They stood together as darkness gathered. Two people who'd survived everything the world could throw at them and had somehow built something worth preserving from the wreckage. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. There was no magical resolution where all problems disappeared or pain stopped mattering. The world remained complicated and brutal and unfair. Power still corrupted. Violence still solved some problems that nothing else could touch. Survival still required difficult choices that left marks on everyone involved. But within that harsh reality, they'd carved out space for something better. Not perfect, just better. And in a world where most people with power never bothered trying to improve, where brutality was often the path of least resistance, where change required sustained effort over years rather than sudden transformation, that small increment of better was worth everything it had cost. Caedric had spent his youth learning to be a weapon, his adulthood discovering that weapons without conscience destroyed everything they touched, his later years figuring out how to be both strong and human simultaneously. It was the hardest thing he'd ever attempted, required more courage than any battle, demanded more strength than maintaining control through fear. But standing on that balcony with Elara beside him, looking at a province that had transformed from something built on terror into something resembling functional community, Caedric finally understood the truth his father had never learned. The real measure of strength wasn't how much fear you could inspire. It was how much weight you could carry while still treating people like they mattered. How many difficult choices you could make while still maintaining conscience. How much power you could wield while still remembering what it felt like to be powerless. It was hard, exhausting, would remain difficult until the day he died. But it was also the only thing worth doing, the only legacy worth leaving, the only way to ensure that everything he'd survived and everyone who'd died getting here hadn't been wasted on just maintaining another brutal system that would collapse the moment pressure exceeded breaking points. Blackthornne Keep stood as it had for centuries. Obsidian walls and iron gates and fortifications designed to withstand siege. But inside those walls, something had transformed. Something fragile and improbable and infinitely precious. Humanity. Complicated. Messy. Requiring constant attention and care. But real. Sustainable. Worth every sacrifice it had demanded. And as the last light faded from the sky, as stars appeared overhead like promises the universe actually intended to keep, Caedric and Elara remained on their balcony, two people who'd learned that the hardest battles weren't fought with swords. They were fought with choices, day after day, year after year. The decision to keep trying even when trying was painful. The commitment to growth, even when growth meant confronting everything you'd rather forget. The understanding that redemption wasn't a destination, it was a direction. A path you walked for as long as you lived, never fully arriving but always moving forward. That was the truth Blackthorne had finally learned. After centuries of rule through fear, after generations of dukes who thought brutality was strength, after all the blood and conspiracy and siege, the province had learned that true strength wasn't about domination. It was about partnership. Not about control, but about trust. Not about fear, but about the much harder work of building something worth believing in. And though the world beyond Blackthorne's borders remained brutal and unforgiving, though power still corrupted and violence still solved problems that nothing else could touch, within these walls they'd proven something crucial. That change was possible. Even for people who thought they were beyond saving. Even in systems designed to resist transformation. Even when every instinct screamed that the old ways were safer. Change was possible. If you were willing to pay the price. If you committed fully. If you refused to surrender even when surrender looked easier. The Duke and Duchess of Blackthorne had paid that price. In blood and pain and years of sustained effort. In difficult choices and haunting memories and the constant weight of trying to be better than their worst instincts. And standing together as darkness settled over their province, looking at everything they'd built and everything it had cost, they finally understood what their story had always been about. Not conquest, not power, not survival through brutality, but transformation. The slow, agonizing, infinitely worthwhile process of becoming human again after years of being weapons. It was enough. Not perfect, but enough. And in a world where perfect was impossible and enough was rare, that was its own form of victory, the kind that actually lasted.